June of 2018 was when everything changed for me, when my faith in the badge and the uniform got tested in ways they never prepare you for at the academy. 26 and already 4 years into highway patrol, I thought I'd seen enough late-night wrecks and DUIs to last a lifetime working the graveyard shift on State Route 47. Most nights consisted of speeding tickets, the occasional drunk driver, maybe helping someone with a flat tire on that long stretch of nothing between Millbrook and Canton. My sergeant used to joke that the most dangerous part of our job was staying awake through those endless dark hours when the radio stayed quiet and the road stretched empty for miles. But that particular Thursday night in June taught me that sometimes the quiet is when you need to be most alert, when predators count on your routine and isolation to spring their trap. Dispatch came through at 2:47 a.m., cutting through the dead silence in my patrol car like a knife. Single vehicle accident, possible rollover. Caller reported someone pinned and bleeding badly on Old Quarry Road about 8 miles past the county line. I knew that stretch well. A narrow 2-lane that curved through dense pine forest with no streetlights, no houses, just an abandoned limestone quarry that shut down in the 90s. The dispatcher, Nancy, sounded frustrated as she relayed the information. Said the call dropped after maybe 20 seconds and she couldn't get the person back on the line. Cell service out there was spotty at best, dead zones everywhere between the hills. Protocol said wait for backup on remote calls, but when someone's bleeding out, every second matters. I flipped on my lights and pushed the Crown Vic hard through those winding curves, telling Nancy I'd assess the scene first while she tried to route an ambulance from the county hospital. Old Quarry Road appeared in my headlights like a tunnel carved through solid darkness, the pine trees creating walls on both sides that seemed to swallow the light. I kept my spotlight sweeping left and right, looking for any sign of a vehicle off the road or debris that might indicate where someone went over. After about 3 miles in, I spotted it. Fresh tire marks veering hard right, straight through the soft shoulder and into the tree line. My spotlight caught the gleam of metal maybe 30 feet down the embankment. A silver sedan wrapped around a massive oak tree, the driver's side completely crushed. Steam still rose from under the crumpled hood, and I could see dark stains on the shattered windshield that made my gut tighten. I grabbed my flashlight and medical kit, radioing my position to Nancy while I half slid down the muddy slope, my boots struggling for purchase on the wet leaves. When I reached the vehicle, a 2012 Toyota Camry according to the twisted remnants of the trunk badge, the smell hit me first. Copper and gasoline mixed with pine sap and damp earth. Blood covered the driver's seat, pooled on the floor, splattered across the dashboard in a pattern that seemed wrong somehow. Too deliberate, like someone had thrown it rather than bled it. No body though, no victim trapped behind the wheel or thrown through the windshield. I circled the car with my flashlight, checking the back seat, the surrounding brush, calling out for anyone who might have crawled away injured. That's when I noticed the phone, an old iPhone propped carefully on the passenger seat, screen glowing with an active call. A woman's voice played on speaker, desperate and looping. "Please help me, oh God, please, he's coming back, I can hear him. Please somebody help me." The recording repeated every few seconds the same terrified plea, and I realized with a cold certainty that this wasn't a voicemail or a pocket dial. Someone had recorded this and left it playing. I reached for my radio, keeping my other hand on my service weapon as an instinct I couldn't quite explain kicked in. "Nancy, we've got a situation here. This doesn't look right. Possible false report. Requesting immediate backup to my location." Static crackled back at me, then Nancy's voice choppy and breaking up. "Unit 47, say again, you're breaking up. Did you find the victim?" I tried adjusting the radio, moving away from the car to get better reception, but the static only got worse. My GPS unit on the dashboard started flickering, the location jumping around before going dark entirely. Training told me to get back to my vehicle, establish communication, wait for backup, but then I saw headlights crest the ridge about half a mile behind where I'd parked. Not the emergency lights of an ambulance or another patrol car, just regular headlights, moving slow and deliberate down the road toward my position. The headlights stopped about 200 yards from my patrol car, sitting there in the darkness, engine running. I could hear it idling, a diesel sound, heavy like a truck or a large SUV. My radio crackled again and Nancy's voice came through clearer this time. All units, we have a second 911 call reporting shots fired on Old Quarry Road. Caller says an officer is down, requesting all available units respond code 3. My blood turned to ice because I hadn't heard any shots, hadn't reported being fired upon, and I was the only officer on this road. Someone was calling in false reports, trying to flood the scene with responders, or maybe trying to confuse dispatch about what was really happening. I keyed my radio. Nancy, this is Unit 47. I'm code 4. No shots fired. This is a setup. Tell responding units to approach with extreme caution. But when I released the button, I only heard that same static, like something was jamming the frequency. Movement in my peripheral vision made me spin toward the tree line on the opposite side of the road from the wrecked car. 3 figures emerged from the woods, walking steady and purposeful toward my position, spread out in what we called a tactical formation at the academy. They wore dark clothing, faces obscured by baseball caps and bandanas, and I could see the outline of long guns in their hands. My training kicked in hard. Multiple hostiles, superior firepower, compromised communications, isolated location. This wasn't random. They'd studied our response protocols, knew a lone officer would respond to a bleeding victim call, knew the dead zones where radios failed, knew exactly how long it would take backup to arrive even with a shots-fired call. I moved behind the patrol car's engine block, drawing my Glock 22. Knowing 15 rounds wouldn't mean much against 3 rifles, but having no other option. A 4th figure appeared near the vehicle that had stopped up the road, talking into what looked like a handheld radio or phone. The 3 approaching gunmen stopped about 50 yards out, taking positions behind trees, and I heard one of them laugh, a sound that carried clear in the still night air. They weren't rushing, weren't shouting commands, just waiting. And that patience terrified me more than aggression would have. These weren't meth heads or desperate criminals making impulsive decisions. This was calculated, rehearsed, professional. The recording on the phone in the crashed car kept playing its loop, that woman's voice begging for help. And I understood now it was meant to keep me here, to make me hesitate about leaving a potential victim. Every detail had been planned. The blood to make it look real, the phone to sell the emergency, the GPS jammer to prevent tracking, the false 911 calls to confuse response. They'd turned our own procedures into a weapon against us. The smart play was getting back in my patrol car and ramming through whatever they'd set up, but I knew they'd anticipated that too. Sure enough, when I glanced toward my vehicle, I saw liquid spreading under it, pooling dark and reflective in the moonlight. They'd punctured my fuel tank while I was down at the crashed car, probably with a suppressed rifle shot I hadn't even heard. The Crown Vic might make it a mile, maybe 2 before dying, and then I'd be on foot with armed pursuers who knew this terrain. My vest would stop pistol rounds but not rifle fire, and they had all the advantages. Numbers, firepower, preparation, position. I needed to buy time, needed backup to actually receive those false reports and come running, needed to survive the next few minutes until help arrived. The 4th figure by the truck raised something to his shoulder, and I saw the distinctive profile of a scoped rifle. Instead of taking the shot they expected, I did something that probably saved my life. I grabbed the phone from the crashed car and hurled it as far as I could into the woods opposite from the gunman, then immediately sprinted toward the steep embankment that led down to the Old Quarry access road. The recorded voice sailed through the air, still pleading for help, and I heard shouting behind me, confusion as they tried to track both the phone and my movement in the darkness. Branches tore at my uniform as I half fell, half controlled my descent down the 40-foot slope, using trees to slow my momentum, my duty belt catching on roots and rocks. A rifle cracked above me and bark exploded from a pine tree inches from my head. Then another shot sparked off a boulder to my left. They were shooting at sound and movement, not clear targets, which meant their night vision wasn't perfect. I reached the bottom and found the old gravel service road that connected to the quarry, oriented myself, and started running hard toward the main highway 3 miles away, my boots pounding on the loose stones. Behind me, I could hear them crashing through the underbrush. Coordinated pursuit with one group following my path, while another probably circled around to cut me off at the highway. My radio suddenly burst to life with clear signal. Nancy's voice urgent. "Unit 47, what's your status? We have multiple units 5 minutes out." I keyed the mic while running, breath coming in gasps. "Code 3, officers need help. 4 armed suspects, rifles, ambush scenario. Approaching Highway 12 from the quarry road on foot." The next 2 miles were the longest of my life, running in full gear, vest and duty belt weighing me down, listening for vehicles or footsteps behind me. I heard engines in the distance getting closer, and couldn't tell if it was the suspects or backup. When I finally burst out of the tree line onto Highway 12, 5 patrol cars were screaming toward me, lights painting the forest red and blue. I waved them down, pointing back toward the quarry road, and collapsed against the first unit that stopped, legs shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion. The aftermath revealed just how sophisticated the operation was. The crashed car was stolen 3 states over, the blood was pig's blood from a slaughterhouse, and the phone had been programmed to call 911 through a spoofed cell tower they'd set up in a van. Investigators found the same group had hit 2 other officers in neighboring states using similar tactics, one in Missouri who wasn't as lucky as me and took a round through his shoulder before backup arrived. They tracked the crew through the burner phones they'd used, tracing them to a militia group that specifically targeted law enforcement, studying our protocols through leaked training materials and emergency response recordings they'd obtained through FOIA requests. All 4 were arrested 2 weeks later during a raid on a compound in Arkansas, and they found maps of rural patrol routes, radio frequencies, and detailed notes on response times for dozens of jurisdictions. I still work highway patrol, but now on day shift in a more populated district, and I never respond to remote calls alone, no matter what the emergency sounds like. That woman's recorded voice still visits my dreams sometimes, pleading for help that was never real, a ghost created specifically to draw me into their crosshairs. "7 months have passed since that night, and I still avoid Interstate 24 whenever possible. People ask me why I quit trucking after 15 years on the road, why I sold my rig and took a desk job that pays half what I used to make. I tell them I got tired of the lifestyle, that my back couldn't handle those long hauls anymore, but the truth sits heavy in my chest like a stone I can't digest. I need to share what I saw, what I reported, what they found because of my call. Maybe putting it out here will help me sleep, without seeing those faces pressed against the glass, without hearing those sounds that weren't supposed to exist at a rest area 40 miles from nowhere." I'd been driving the Nashville to Memphis route for about 3 years by then, usually making 2 or 3 runs a week, hauling auto parts for a distribution center. That particular Monday in early October started like any other. I loaded up around noon and figured I'd push through to Memphis before stopping for my mandatory rest period. But my coffee thermos ran dry somewhere past mile marker 85, and my eyelids started getting heavy, so I decided to pull into the old rest area near the county line. Most truckers avoided that spot because the facilities were run down and the parking lot lights barely worked, but it was quiet and I just needed a few hours of sleep before continuing on. The parking lot had maybe 4 other trucks scattered around when I pulled in, which wasn't unusual for that time of evening. I parked near the edge where the trees gave some shade during the day, killed the engine, and climbed into my sleeper cab. I'd just gotten comfortable when I heard what sounded like someone yelling, but it was muffled and distant, like it was coming from behind the main building. At first I figured it was just drivers arguing over something stupid. Maybe someone had blocked someone else in, so I ignored it and tried to settle back down. But then I heard it again, higher pitched this time, almost like a woman screaming, and my whole body went rigid because there shouldn't have been any women at that rest area at 2 in the morning. I sat up and looked through my windshield toward the main building, a long concrete structure that housed the bathrooms and some old vending machines that hadn't worked in years. Behind it, Barely visible in the darkness, I could make out what looked like a newer addition. A metal building with a couple of floodlights aimed at a door marked, "Authorized personnel only." As I watched, that door opened and two men walked out, one in what looked like a uniform, maybe private security, and they were half carrying, half dragging someone between them. The person's head was down, their feet barely touching the ground, and even from that distance I could tell something was very wrong with how they were moving, like they couldn't support their own weight. They loaded the person into the back of a white van that I hadn't noticed before, parked right up against the building. One of the men slammed the door shut while the other walked around to the driver's side, and that's when I saw the logo on his shirt catch the light. Roadside Protection Services, with some kind of badge design underneath. The van pulled away, not toward the highway but down a service road that ran deeper into the woods behind the rest area. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but then I stopped because what would I even say? That I saw security guards putting someone in a van? They'd probably tell me it was none of my business. Maybe someone got sick or hurt and they were taking them for help. But I couldn't ignore what I'd heard. Those screams that didn't sound like someone who was hurt. They sounded like someone who was terrified. I decided to take a walk just to stretch my legs, I told myself. Maybe wander over toward that building and see if anything else seemed out of place. I grabbed my flashlight, one of those heavy metal ones that doubles as a weapon if you need it to, and stepped out of my cab. The October air hit me like ice water, way colder than it should have been for that time of year, and I could smell something chemical in the air, like bleach mixed with something else I couldn't identify. The other trucks in the lot were all dark, their drivers probably asleep, and I felt completely alone as I started walking toward the main building. I circled around the side of the restroom building, staying in the shadows as much as possible, my heart hammering so loud I was sure anyone nearby could hear it. The closer I got to that metal addition, the stronger that chemical smell became, and now I could hear other sounds, a low humming like industrial fans running, and underneath that, voices. Multiple voices, some talking, some crying, some just making these low moaning sounds that made my stomach turn. There was a window on the side of the building, covered with some kind of reflective film, but there was a corner where it had peeled away. I crept up to it, keeping my flashlight off, and pressed my eye to that small gap. What I saw in that room will haunt me until the day I die. There were mattresses on the floor, maybe 8 or 9 of them, each with a person curled up on it. Most were women. Young women, though. I spotted at least 2 who couldn't have been older than 16. Their wrists were zip-tied to metal rings bolted into the wall, giving them just enough slack to lie down but not enough to reach the door. Some were dressed in regular clothes that were torn and dirty. Others wore these cheap-looking robes that barely covered them. One girl near the window was awake, staring at nothing with eyes that looked completely empty, like she'd given up hoping anyone would find her. A man in that same Roadside Protection Services uniform sat in a chair by the door, scrolling through his phone like he was just pulling a regular security shift, like those weren't human beings chained to the walls around him. I backed away from that window, my legs shaking so bad I nearly fell. I needed to get back to my truck, call 911, call the FBI, call anybody who would listen. But as I turned to leave, a hand grabbed my shoulder and spun me around. Another security guard, this one bigger, with a scar that ran from his ear to the corner of his mouth. He looked at me for a long moment, then smiled this cold smile and said, "You lost, driver?" I mumbled something about looking for the bathroom, but he wasn't buying it. His hand moved to his belt where I could see a gun holstered, and he said, "Bathrooms in the main building. This area's restricted. Company property." I nodded, started to walk away, and that's when I saw it. A state patrol car parked behind the building, partially hidden by a dumpster. The engine was running, but the lights were off. The guard must have seen me notice the patrol car because his whole demeanor changed. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell cigarettes and something sour on his breath, and said, "You didn't see nothing tonight, understand? You're gonna walk back to your truck, you're gonna drive away, and you're gonna forget this rest stop exists. Otherwise, well, truckers go missing all the time. Dangerous highways, especially for drivers who stick their nose where it doesn't belong. He patted the gun on his hip to make sure I got the message. I nodded again, turned around and forced myself to walk, not run, back to my truck. My whole body was screaming at me to sprint, but I knew he was watching. Probably had others watching too. When I finally made it to my cab, I locked the doors, started the engine, and pulled out of that rest area as calm as I could manage, even though every instinct told me to floor it. I drove for about 5 miles before I pulled over at a gas station that was bright and busy, full of normal people doing normal things. My fingers were shaking so bad it took 3 tries to dial 911. The dispatcher who answered sounded bored at first, probably used to getting calls about fender benders and speeding complaints. But when I started describing what I'd seen, her voice changed completely. She kept me on the line, transferred me to someone else, then someone else again. Within 10 minutes, I was talking to an FBI agent who told me to stay exactly where I was, that they were sending someone to meet me immediately. 2 agents showed up within the hour, and I told them everything: the room, the girls, the security company, and most importantly, that state patrol car hidden behind the building. What happened next was all over the news for weeks, though they kept my name out of it, thank God. They raided that rest area just before dawn with a joint task force of FBI and state police from a different district, not local. They found 14 women and girls, the youngest just 15, all victims of trafficking. The Roadside Protection Services was a shell company that had somehow gotten a legitimate contract with the state to provide security for several rest areas along the interstate. They'd been using that cover to run their operation for almost 4 years. The real kicker came when they arrested everyone involved. Among them were 2 local cops who'd been using their patrol cars to transport victims and provide cover when needed. One of them was a sergeant with 18 years on the force, a family man with 3 kids who'd been living a complete double life. I testified before a grand jury 3 months later, behind a screen so the defendants couldn't see my face. All of them got convicted. The 2 cops got 25 to life, the security guards got similar sentences, and they tracked down 3 more people who were running the money side of things. The victims, the ones who survived, were given counseling and help starting over, though I doubt any amount of therapy erases what they went through. As for me, I couldn't drive truck anymore. Every rest stop looked sinister. Every security guard made me nervous, and I kept wondering how many other places like that are operating right now, hidden in plain sight. I work in a warehouse now, home every night, and I never take the interstate if I can avoid it. People think I'm paranoid when I tell them to be careful at rest stops, to never get out alone at night. But I know what's out there. I know that sometimes the people meant to protect us are the very ones doing the harm, and that knowledge changed something fundamental in how I see the world. Mile marker 142 on Highway 65 is where everything changed for me. I'd passed that same green sign probably 1,000 times during my years with Tennessee Highway Patrol, never thinking it would become a landmark I'd never forget. That Wednesday afternoon, traffic was light, just the usual mix of semis and commuters heading north toward Kentucky. 23 years wearing the badge teaches you to read vehicles like other people read faces, and that beat-up Corolla maintaining exactly 55 in the right lane was trying too hard to be nobody. Perfect speed, perfect lane position, like someone had coached the driver on how to be invisible. The spider web crack spreading across the left taillight gave me legal cause to make the stop. The driver pulled over with mechanical precision, positioning the car so perfectly parallel to the shoulder line it seemed practiced. Through my windshield, I watched him arrange both hands at 10 and 2 before I even stepped out of my cruiser. That kind of rehearsed compliance always makes me pay closer attention. I ran the plates while walking up, registered to a Paul Brennan from Cookville, clean record, nothing remarkable. But when I reached his window and he rolled it down, the smell hit me immediately. Multiple air fresheners fighting each other, creating a chemical cloud that made my eyes water. His forehead gleamed with perspiration despite the 40-degree weather, and when he passed me his license, his fingers trembled enough to make the plastic card flutter like a moth wing. Paul Brennan matched his photo, but nothing else about him matched a normal traffic stop. He answered my questions about where he was headed with single words, Memphis, while his eyes kept flicking to his rearview mirror. Not checking for traffic, but checking his trunk area through the back window. Quick glances, then back to me, then to the trunk again. His breathing came in these controlled little bursts, like someone counting between inhales. I asked him to step out of the vehicle, and he complied so fast he nearly fell getting out. Standing there beside his car, he kept shifting his weight, rocking slightly, his hands opening and closing at his sides. The temperature was dropping as the sun set behind us, but fresh sweat kept beading on his upper lip. I asked him about the air fresheners, keeping my tone conversational, just curious why he needed so many. He stuttered through an explanation about buying the car used, said it had a smell he couldn't get out, something about spilled milk in the summer. But his voice cracked on the word summer, and he immediately looked at the trunk again. That's when I heard it, or thought I did. A soft thump from the rear of the vehicle. Could have been the exhaust cooling, could have been the wind hitting the car just right. Brennan heard it too because his whole body went rigid. He started talking faster, saying he really needed to get to Memphis, had a job interview in the morning, couldn't be late. The words tumbled out while his feet stayed planted like they were glued to the asphalt. I told him I needed to check his vehicle, standard procedure for the taillight violation, make sure everything else was in working order. His face changed then, went from nervous to something else, something desperate. He asked if I had to, said he'd fix the taillight as soon as he got to Memphis, promised to get it done first thing. When I insisted, he took a step backward, just one step, but enough to make me adjust my stance. His keys were still in the ignition, engine running, and I could see him calculating distances. I've seen that look before, guys deciding whether to run or fight or comply. I kept my voice steady, told him this would just take a minute, asked him to pop the trunk. He said the latch was broken, said he'd been meaning to fix it, said a lot of things that didn't explain why his whole body was shaking now. I walked around to the trunk myself, Brennan trailing behind me, still talking about Memphis and interviews and broken latches. The trunk had scratches around the lock, fresh ones that gleamed silver against the faded paint. When I pressed the release button inside the car, nothing happened. Brennan said, "See, told you broken," but his voice had gone high and thin. I got my flashlight and crouched down, looking at the latch mechanism, and that's when I heard it clearly. Not a thump this time, but movement, deliberate movement, and what sounded like breathing that wasn't coming from Brennan or me. I stood up and looked him in the eye, told him to open the trunk right now. He shook his head, said he couldn't. Said, "Please, officer, just let me go. I'll throw away the taillight. I'll never drive through Tennessee again." I called for backup then, keeping my eyes on Brennan while I spoke into my radio. His shoulders sagged when he heard me give our location, and he sat down right there on the cold asphalt, put his head in his hands. Started saying he didn't know, they just paid him to drive. $500 to take the car to Memphis and leave it at a rest stop. Said he never looked, never asked questions, just needed the money. While we waited for backup, I kept hearing those sounds from the trunk, stronger now, rhythmic tapping like someone trying to signal. I told Brennan we were opening that trunk one way or another, and he just nodded, defeated. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a second key, one that wasn't on his main ring. Said they gave him this one separately, told him to never use it unless instructed. His hand shook so bad when he held it out that I had to take it from him. The key turned smooth in the lock, and the trunk popped open with a soft click. The smell hit first, human sweat and fear and something chemical, like chlorine. She was curled in the fetal position, a girl maybe 16 or 17, duct tape around her wrists and ankles, another piece hanging loose from her mouth where she'd managed to work it free. Her eyes were huge, blinking in the sudden light, and she made this sound, half sob, half gasp. I reached for her and she flinched back, pressing herself against the wheel well. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and when she tried to speak, only a rasp came out. I told her she was safe now, kept repeating it while I cut the tape with my knife, but she kept staring past me at Brennan, who was crying now, saying over and over that he didn't know she was so young, didn't know anything except where to drive. Backup arrived in minutes, 2 more patrol cars and an ambulance that I'd requested the moment I saw her. The paramedics wrapped her in blankets, gave her water in small sips while checking her vitals. She'd been in that trunk for at least 8 hours, according to what she managed to whisper. Grabbed from a mall parking lot in Kentucky, she remembered a white van, then waking up in darkness hearing road noise. They'd moved her twice before Brennan's car, she said. Different vehicles each time, always at rest stops. While the EMTs worked on her, Brennan started talking to anyone who would listen. Names of rest stops, times he was supposed to arrive, a phone number that called him with instructions. He swore he thought he was moving drugs, said they told him it was pills, that the weird sounds were just the packages shifting. But his story kept changing, and we all knew he was lying about what he knew. The girl, Haley was her name, told us about hearing other voices when they transferred her. Not just one person, but several, speaking in code words about packages and delivery times. She'd memorized some of what she heard through the tape over her mouth, kept repeating it to herself to stay focused, to stay sane. Routes they mentioned, something about a warehouse near Louisville, regular runs every few days. The detectives who arrived started mapping it out while Haley was still in the ambulance. This wasn't random, wasn't opportunistic. This was organized, methodical, using people like Brennan who needed quick cash and wouldn't ask questions. The broken taillight hadn't even been accidental. Haley heard them talking about keeping speeds perfect, never giving cops a reason to stop them. But they couldn't control everything. Couldn't fix that crack that spread just enough to catch my eye at mile marker 142. What Brennan gave us that night opened everything up like pulling a thread on a cheap sweater. The phone number led to a burner, but the tower pings showed patterns, regular stops at specific locations across 3 states. Within a week, FBI got involved, found the warehouse Haley had heard them mention. 12 more girls were recovered over the next month, some who'd been missing for years, others grabbed just days before. The rest stops Brennan named were all monitored, and they caught 3 more drivers, each with their own story about easy money and not asking questions. Each arrest led to more phone numbers, more locations, more girls who made it home. They traced money transfers to accounts in 5 different states, fake businesses that existed only on paper, a whole network that had been operating for at least 3 years according to the federal prosecutors. Haley testified 8 months later, her voice steady in the courtroom as she identified 2 of the men who'd transferred her between vehicles. She'd gone back to school, was seeing a therapist, trying to piece her life back together. Her parents sent me a letter, thanking me for stopping that car, for noticing that taillight. But I keep thinking about all the other Corollas doing exactly 55, all the other drivers with perfect lane position and rehearsed compliance that I didn't stop. Brennan got 15 years as part of a plea deal for his cooperation. The investigation is still ongoing, they tell me. New leads coming in every week. I still patrol Highway 65, still pass mile marker 142 every shift. Now I watch for more than just broken taillights. I watch for cars trying not to exist, for drivers who know their scripts too well, for that particular kind of fear that has nothing to do with getting a ticket. Because now I know what might be in those trunks, who might be counting the minutes in darkness hoping someone notices something wrong enough to take a closer look. Six years into working Colorado State Patrol, I thought I'd developed pretty good instincts about when something was wrong. My 30th birthday was still 2 months out that March morning in 2017, and I'd pulled over enough vehicles on Interstate 70 to know the difference between someone who forgot to renew their tags and someone actively avoiding the DMV for a reason. The silver Dodge Caravan that passed my radar position near the Lyman exit had registration stickers that expired the previous July, faded and peeling at the edges. It was a Wednesday, clear and brutally cold. The kind of high plains weather where the sky stretches forever and there's nowhere to hide. I hit my lights and pulled out behind the van, watching as it drifted slowly onto the shoulder with this hesitant quality that made my gut tighten. Most people pull over quickly when they see the lights, annoyed but compliant. This driver took almost a quarter mile, like they were running through scenarios in their head. When I walked up to the driver's side window, a woman in her mid-40s smiled up at me with too many teeth showing. She had short brown hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and wore a purple fleece jacket with some motivational phrase stitched across the chest in white thread. Before I could say anything, she launched into this explanation about being a foster caregiver, transporting 3 children to Denver for a mandatory meeting with their caseworker. Her hands moved constantly while she talked, touching her necklace, adjusting her glasses, gripping the steering wheel. She told me her name was Denise Calabresi and kept emphasizing how important it was that she get these kids to their appointment on time. Something about her energy felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced this speech. I asked for her license and registration, and while she dug through her glove box, I looked past her into the back of the van. 3 children sat in the middle and rear seats, completely motionless. The oldest was a girl, maybe 9 or 10, with long dark hair hanging over her face as she slumped against the window. 2 younger boys occupied the other seats, their heads tilted forward at angles that looked painful. None of them moved, none of them blinked. They didn't even seem to register that a cop was standing 5 feet away. I asked Denise if the children were all right, keeping my voice casual, but watching her reaction carefully. She barely glanced back at them before answering that they were fine, just tired from the early morning start. She said she'd picked them up at 5 in the morning from a group home in Burlington, that they'd been up late the night before, that kids always fell asleep in the car. Her explanations came rapid fire, each one slightly different from the last, and she kept insisting we needed to get moving or they'd miss their appointment. I told her to sit tight while I ran her information, taking the license and registration back to my patrol car. The paperwork looked legitimate at first glance, a Colorado driver's license issued 2 years prior, vehicle registration in her name. But when I ran her license through dispatch, something felt wrong even before the response came back. The address on file was a P.O. box in Grand Junction, over 200 miles west. The vehicle had been purchased with cash 3 months earlier from a private seller in Pueblo. While I waited for more information, I kept watching the van in my rearview mirror. Denise sat rigid in the driver's seat, both hands on the wheel, even though the engine was off. The children in the back hadn't shifted position at all, not once. The girl's head remained pressed against the window at the exact same angle. One of the boys had his mouth hanging open slightly, and in the 7 or 8 minutes I'd been sitting there, he hadn't closed it, or swallowed, or done any of the tiny unconscious movements that people make. That's when dispatch came back with additional details that changed everything. Denise Calabresi had a prior arrest in Utah from 2015 for child endangerment, charges that were later dropped. More concerning, the vehicle registration showed 5 previous owners in the past 18 months, which is practically unheard of for a 7-year-old minivan. Something about this entire situation had shifted from routine traffic stop to something much darker. I called for backup and approached the van again, this time asking Denise to step out of the vehicle. Her smile finally disappeared. She stepped out slowly, still talking, still trying to control the narrative. She pulled a manila folder from the passenger seat and thrust it toward me, saying it contained all the necessary documentation for the transport: court orders, foster care paperwork, medical records for the children. I flipped through the pages while keeping her in my peripheral vision. The documents looked official enough, complete with agency letterhead and case numbers and signatures from judges. But I'd seen enough forged paperwork in my career to notice the small inconsistencies. The fonts didn't quite match between pages. One signature was clearly photocopied and pasted digitally onto multiple documents. The case numbers followed a format that didn't align with how Colorado actually structured their child services files. When I pointed out these discrepancies, Denise's entire demeanor changed. The friendly foster mom persona evaporated, and she became defensive, angry even, demanding to know why I was harassing someone just trying to help children in need. She said I was going to make these kids late for their appointment, that there would be consequences, that I didn't understand how the system worked. My backup arrived within 10 minutes, another trooper named Vincent Reyes, who I'd worked with dozens of times. While he talked to Denise, keeping her away from the vehicle, I opened the van's sliding door to check on the children. The smell hit me immediately, this stale recycled air mixed with something chemical and sweet that I couldn't place. The girl in the back seat didn't react when I said hello. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing. When I gently touched her shoulder, she made this small sound, not quite a word, more like a confused mumble. The two boys were in similar states, awake but not really conscious, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated when they tried to respond to my questions. I asked the girl what her name was, and she took almost 30 seconds to answer. Her words slurred like she was coming out of anesthesia. She said her name was Olivia, but she couldn't tell me her last name or where she was from or why she was in the van. The younger boy, who looked about 5, couldn't answer any questions at all. He just stared at his own hands like he'd never seen them before. I immediately called for an ambulance, telling dispatch we had 3 minors who appeared to be drugged, and requested a supervisor to respond to the scene. Denise started screaming then, actually screaming, about how we were destroying these children's lives, how their real parents were monsters, how she was protecting them from abuse. She kept shouting that we didn't understand, that the system was broken, that good people had to step in when the government failed. Vincent had to physically restrain her and put her in handcuffs because she tried to run back to the van. The whole time she was yelling names and details, saying Olivia's father had been reported for abuse 12 times, that the boy's mother was an addict, that someone had to save them. But when I asked her how she knew these children, how she'd gotten custody of them, where the actual court orders were, she went silent, just stared at me with this disturbing conviction in her eyes, like she genuinely believed she was the hero in this situation. The ambulance arrived and paramedics loaded all 3 kids onto gurneys. Olivia was trying to stay awake but kept drifting off mid-sentence. The smallest boy had vomited on himself at some point and didn't even seem aware of it. The hospital in Lyman stabilized the children and ran blood work that came back showing dangerous levels of diphenhydramine in their systems, the active ingredient in sleep medication. The doctors said all 3 kids had been systematically drugged for at least 3 to 4 days based on the concentrations in their blood. They were severely dehydrated, malnourished, and showed signs of being restrained for extended periods. Olivia had ligature marks around her wrists that were several days old. When she finally became coherent enough to talk, around 6 hours after we'd brought her in, she told investigators that a woman had taken her from a playground near her school in Kansas 5 days earlier. The woman had told her that her mother sent her to pick Olivia up, that there was an emergency. Olivia said she'd been kept in a basement somewhere, that she'd been given medicine that made her sleep, that there were other people there talking about saving children. The 2 boys had similar stories, though the younger one was still too confused to give many details. Both had been taken from different locations in Kansas over the previous week. What came out during the investigation over the following weeks was somehow worse than a single kidnapping. Federal agents from the FBI got involved immediately because the children had been transported across state lines, and what they uncovered was a network of people operating through private social media groups who believed they were rescuing children from abusive situations. These weren't licensed foster agencies or legitimate child protection services. They were ordinary people, dozens of them scattered across multiple states, who'd convinced themselves that the legal system was failing children and that they needed to take matters into their own hands. They called themselves child advocates and freedom networkers, communicating through encrypted messaging apps and closed groups with names like Justice for Innocence and Safe Harbor Collective. Denise had been part of this network for almost 2 years, and her phone records showed hundreds of messages coordinating what they called extractions. They'd share information about families involved in custody disputes, parents who'd been reported to child services, any situation where they decided a child was in danger. Then they'd plan abductions, creating fake documentation, arranging temporary hiding places and eventually transport routes to move children to other members of the network in different states. The really disturbing part was how they justified everything. Agents found manifestos and shared documents in these groups where members talked about being warriors for children, about how traditional channels had failed, about their moral obligation to act. They'd screenshot news articles about child abuse cases, posts from parents venting about custody battles, anything they could twist into evidence that they needed to intervene. Olivia's father had never been charged with abuse. Those 12 reports Denise mentioned were actually a contentious divorce where Olivia's mother had filed complaints that were investigated and found to be unsubstantiated. But someone in the network had decided that meant the system was covering up abuse, and they'd targeted Olivia for extraction. The 2 boys had been taken from their grandmother's care while their mother completed a rehabilitation program. Their caseworker had regular contact with them, and they were scheduled to reunify with their mother within a month. But the network had seen a social media post about the mother's previous addiction and decided the children needed to be saved. They'd watched the grandmother's house, learned her routine, and taken the boys from her backyard while she was inside making lunch. Over 40 people were eventually arrested across 7 states as the investigation expanded. They found children being held in basements, spare bedrooms, even a converted garage where a couple in Arizona was keeping 2 siblings they'd taken from a shopping mall parking lot in New Mexico. Some of the children had been missing for months, their families desperate and destroyed, while their captors genuinely believed they were protecting them. The network had a system for creating false identities, forged documents that looked authentic enough to fool most people at a glance. They had members who worked in print shops, others with graphic design skills, people who'd figured out how to replicate official seals and signatures. Denise herself had been holding children at a property outside Grand Junction before transporting them to other network members. Investigators found a room in that house set up like a dormitory with 6 mattresses on the floor, bottles of sleep medication in the cabinet, and restraints hidden in a closet. She'd been moving kids through that location for over a year, and some of the children they recovered couldn't even remember their real names anymore because they'd been told they were someone else for so long. The thing that still gets to me, the part I can't shake even now, is how close Denise came to succeeding. If her registration tags hadn't been expired, if I'd been running radar somewhere else that morning, if I hadn't noticed the way those kids sat so unnaturally still, she would have made it to Denver. She had contacts there ready to take those 3 children and move them further into the network, maybe out of the country eventually. Olivia would have disappeared completely, and her parents would have spent the rest of their lives wondering what happened to their daughter. The 2 boys would have become ghosts. Their grandmother blamed herself until the day she died. All 3 kids had to go through months of therapy, and Olivia still has nightmares according to the victim advocate who stayed in touch with me. Denise Calabresi was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, and she never showed remorse. At her sentencing, she gave this speech about how history would vindicate her, how she'd done what was necessary, how the real criminals were the people who let children suffer. 47 other network members received sentences ranging from 5 to 25 years. The FBI shut down the online groups, but I know there are probably others out there, different names and different platforms, people who've convinced themselves that their twisted logic justifies stealing children. I think about that every single time I pull someone over now. Every traffic stop, every expired tag, every minor violation could be the thread that unravels something terrible. That silver minivan taught me that evil doesn't always look like what you expect. Sometimes it looks like a middle-aged woman in a purple fleece jacket, with an inspirational quote stitched on the chest, smiling at you through a car window while 3 drugged children sit silent in the back seat. People always ask me why I still drive during the day now, why I plan my routes to avoid stopping anywhere remote. The answer isn't simple, and honestly, most folks don't want to hear it. But I'll tell you anyway because what happened along Interstate 20 changed everything about how I see the road. April of 2015 marked my 12th year working highway patrol for the Alabama Department of Public Safety. My sergeant's exam was 2 weeks away, and I'd been pulling extra shifts to prove I could handle the responsibility. The stretch of I-20 between the Georgia line and Birmingham was my territory. 160 miles of asphalt I knew better than my own neighborhood. Rest areas were normally the quietest part of my shift, just truckers catching sleep and families letting kids burn off energy. That Tuesday morning in early April, everything looked routine when dispatch sent me to mile marker 165. The rest area sat about 40 miles east of Birmingham, one of those older facilities the state kept meaning to renovate but never got around to funding. Nothing fancy, just bathrooms, vending machines, and a few picnic tables under some pine trees. When I pulled in around 7 in the morning, the sun was already burning off the fog, and I counted maybe 4 vehicles in the lot. A silver Toyota Camry sat alone near the far end, away from the main building. The driver's door hung open. I remember thinking someone probably left it ajar by accident, maybe rushing to the bathroom. But as I got closer, I saw him slumped against the steering wheel, and there was blood on the window. A Glock 19 lay on the passenger seat. My training kicked in immediately, securing the scene, calling for backup and medical even though I could tell he was gone. The man's name was Jeffrey Pruitt, a sales manager from Atlanta heading home after a conference in Mississippi. 46 years old, married, 2 kids in college. The investigation lasted 3 days before they ruled it a suicide. I didn't think much about it after filing my report. Suicides happened on highways more than people realized, usually guys going through divorces or facing bankruptcy who couldn't handle the pressure anymore. The case file went to the county coroner, and I moved on to the next call. But 6 weeks later, on a Wednesday in late May, dispatch sent me to mile marker 142, same highway, different rest area. This one was smaller, just a parking lot with bathrooms and a pet walking area. A white Ford F-150 sat by itself near the tree line. The driver was a woman named Angela Cortez, a nursing supervisor from Louisiana, driving to visit her sister in Atlanta. 51 years old, recently promoted at work, no history of depression according to her family. She'd been shot once in the right temple with a Smith & Wesson revolver that belonged to her late father. The weapon was still in her right hand when the cleaning crew found her that morning. Again, investigators called it suicide, and again, something about it bothered me, but I couldn't articulate what. The third one happened in early July, mile marker 188, a rest area on the other side of Birmingham that technically wasn't even my usual patrol zone. I only heard about it because the trooper who responded, a guy named Calvin I'd gone through the academy with, mentioned it during a shift change. Another apparent suicide, another isolated rest area, another victim with no obvious motive. This time it was a man named Howard Chen, a restaurant owner from Texas driving to a food service convention in Georgia. 63 years old, grandfather of 5, pillars of his community back in Houston. He'd supposedly shot himself with a Ruger that investigators found wiped clean of prints except for his own. Calvin said the scene felt staged to him, too neat, too convenient. But physical evidence supported suicide, and without proof of foul play, the case closed within a week. I started keeping my own notes after that conversation, writing down dates and locations in a notebook I kept in my patrol car. By mid-August, 2 more bodies turned up at rest areas along I-20, both ruled suicides within days of discovery. The pattern became impossible to ignore. All 5 deaths occurred between 6 and 8 in the morning, always at older, less traveled facilities, always single gunshot wounds to the head, always with the victim's own registered firearm. The geographical spread covered nearly 200 miles of interstate, but something connected them beyond coincidence. I brought my concerns to Sergeant Daniels during our weekly briefing, laying out the timeline and locations on a map I'd marked up with red circles. He listened, arms crossed, expression unreadable. When I finished, he pointed out that 5 suicides over 4 months across multiple counties didn't constitute a pattern worth investigating. especially when every scene supported the official conclusion. He told me to focus on my regular duties and stop wasting time on closed cases. But I couldn't let it go. That night, I requested copies of all 5 incident reports through official channels, claiming I needed them for a training presentation on suicide prevention. The reports arrived 3 days later, and I spent an entire weekend going through every detail with a highlighter and notepad. The ballistics information caught my attention first. In 3 of the 5 cases, the forensic reports noted unusual stippling patterns around the entrance wounds, inconsistent with self-inflicted injuries at close range. The powder burn suggested the barrel had been held at a slightly different angle than what you'd expect from someone shooting themselves. It was subtle enough that individual investigators missed it, but when you compared all 5 reports side by side, the similarity became obvious. Then I noticed the timing. Every single death occurred within a 90-minute window, between 6:15 and 7:45 in the morning, when rest areas typically had minimal traffic. Security cameras at these facilities were either broken or positioned to cover only the bathroom entrances, not the parking areas. Whoever was doing this understood rest area layouts and surveillance limitations better than most law enforcement officers would. I started reviewing highway camera footage next, submitting requests through the Department of Transportation database. Most agencies don't realize how much footage gets archived, especially on major interstates where traffic monitoring runs constantly. I focused on the hours preceding each death, looking for vehicles that appeared near multiple scenes. The work took weeks because I could only access the system during my shifts without raising suspicion. In late September, I found what I'd been searching for: a dark blue Dodge Ram pickup, extended cab, no visible plates in most frames, appeared on camera footage within 2 hours of 4 different rest area deaths. The truck always traveled eastbound, always during early morning hours, and always exited the interstate at the ramp just past each facility. I traced its movements backward and discovered it entered the highway from different on-ramps each time, never establishing a predictable pattern. But there was something else, something that made my chest tighten when I spotted it. The truck had a light bar mounted across the roof, the kind volunteer firefighters or security contractors use, perfectly legal to own, but illegal to activate on public roads, unless you're emergency personnel. I made copies of every frame showing that truck, burned them to a disk, and locked it in my personal locker at the station. The next morning, I drove to the Alabama Bureau of Investigation field office in Birmingham and asked to speak with whoever handled serial crime cases. They assigned me to an investigator named Special Agent Fitzgerald, a woman in her early 50s who'd worked organized crime before transferring to major case investigations. I laid everything out for her: the timeline, the ballistics inconsistencies, the truck, the footage, all of it. She listened without interrupting, taking notes in a leather-bound notebook that looked older than I was. When I finished, she asked me one question: did anyone else know about my investigation? I told her no, that my sergeant had dismissed my concerns, and I'd been working alone. Fitzgerald nodded slowly, then made a phone call right there in front of me. 20 minutes later, 2 more agents joined us in the conference room, and suddenly my informal inquiry became an official investigation. The Bureau moved fast once they had the footage and ballistics comparisons. Within 72 hours, they'd identified the truck through partial VIN reconstruction from enhanced camera images and cross-referenced it with vehicle registration databases across 6 states. The owner was a man named Glenn Whitaker, 57 years old, former sheriff's deputy from Mississippi, who'd been terminated in 2013 after multiple excessive force complaints. He'd sued the department for wrongful termination, lost, and basically disappeared from law enforcement circles. Property records showed he owned a small house outside Meridian, but neighbors reported seeing him only sporadically. His bank records revealed he'd been making cash deposits every few weeks, amounts that suggested he was working somewhere, but not reporting income. The Bureau also discovered he still had access to decommissioned badges and equipment through a friend who ran a police surplus store. Fitzgerald told me they believed Whitaker was conducting fake traffic stops at rest areas, using his lights and credentials to approach victims who thought they were dealing with legitimate law enforcement. The theory was that he'd target people traveling alone, wait for them to park at isolated rest areas, then approach with his badge and some fabricated violation. Once he had them out of their vehicles or vulnerable inside them, he'd force them to use their own weapons, staging the scenes to look like suicides. The ballistics inconsistencies came from him controlling the gun while making it appear self-inflicted, a technique that required knowledge of forensic investigation procedures. It was methodical, calculated, and absolutely terrifying, because it exploited the one thing most people trust without question on the highway. The Bureau wanted to set up surveillance on Whitaker's property and monitor the interstate for his truck, but Fitzgerald had a different idea. She asked if I'd be willing to work undercover as bait, driving my personal vehicle along I-20 during early morning hours to draw him out. The plan was risky, but federal agents would be tracking me constantly through GPS, and backup units would stay within 3 minutes of my location at all times. I agreed to do it, partly because I wanted this guy caught, and partly because I knew those 5 victims deserved justice their families weren't getting. For 2 weeks in November, I drove my personal Subaru Outback along I-20 during the early morning shift, stopping at different rest areas between the Georgia line and Birmingham. The Bureau had fitted my vehicle with hidden cameras and audio equipment, plus a panic button disguised as my key fob. Every morning felt like walking a tightrope because I had to appear vulnerable enough to attract attention, but alert enough to react if things went wrong. On the 14th day, a Friday morning in mid-November, I pulled into the rest area at mile marker 151 around 6:30. The parking lot was empty except for one semi-truck at the far end, driver probably sleeping in the cab. I parked near the picnic area, killed the engine, and pretended to check my phone. 15 minutes passed, then I saw it in my rearview mirror. That dark blue Dodge Ram rolling slowly into the lot, light bar clearly visible on the roof. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced myself to stay calm, to act natural. The truck parked 2 spaces behind me, angled so its headlights illuminated my vehicle. A man got out wearing what looked like a deputy's uniform, complete with badge and utility belt. He approached my driver's side window with that specific walk law enforcement develops, authoritative but not aggressive. When he knocked on my glass, I rolled it down and tried to look confused rather than terrified. He introduced himself as Deputy Whitaker, said he'd received a report about a vehicle matching mine, involved in a hit-and-run back at mile marker 165, needed to see my license and registration. His voice was calm, professional, exactly how a real officer would sound. I handed him my documents, buying time for the backup units to close in. He examined them for maybe 30 seconds, then handed them back and asked me to step out of the vehicle. That's when I saw his right hand drift toward his belt, not to his radio or citation book, but to a holster that held a Beretta 9mm. I pressed the panic button. Everything happened in less than 90 seconds. 4 unmarked Bureau vehicles came screaming into the rest area from both directions, blocking every exit. Whitaker realized what was happening immediately, his expression shifting from professional calm to pure rage in an instant. He went for his weapon, but agents were already out of their cars, weapons drawn, shouting commands. He put his hands up slowly, that fake badge glinting in the morning sun. They took him down hard on the pavement, cuffed him, and searched his truck on sight. Inside, they found a collection of decommissioned badges from 3 different agencies, 2 sets of magnetic emergency lights, a police radio scanner, and a laptop containing surveillance photos of at least 15 different rest areas along I-20 and Interstate 59. They also found a notebook with dates, times, and vehicle descriptions, including entries that matched all 5 victims. In the glove compartment was a Taurus pistol that ballistics later matched to gunshot residue found at 2 of the crime scenes, residue that shouldn't have existed if the deaths were truly suicides. Whitaker's trial lasted 6 weeks in federal court. Prosecutors charged him with 5 counts of first-degree murder, unlawful impersonation of law enforcement, and a dozen other felonies. The evidence was overwhelming. From the ballistics matches to the surveillance footage to the materials in his truck. His defense tried to argue that he'd been conducting citizen patrols and had nothing to do with the deaths, but the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before convicting him on all counts. He got 5 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. The families of the victims finally got answers, though I know that knowledge probably didn't ease their pain much. As for me, I made sergeant 6 months later, but I never stopped thinking about those 2 weeks in November, about how close I came to becoming the 6th victim in his notebook. These days, I coordinate rest area safety initiatives for the state, making sure cameras cover parking lots and increasing patrol presence during early morning hours. People still ask why I'm so obsessive about it, why I push for funding nobody else thinks is necessary. I just tell them I've seen what happens when we're not watching carefully enough, when someone exploits the trust people place in a badge and a uniform. That's usually enough to end the conversation, because deep down, nobody really wants to think about the fact that the person pulling you over might not be who they claim to be. "15 years on the force, and I thought I'd seen everything." That's what I kept telling myself during those endless overnight shifts patrolling the stretch of Highway 89 between Flagstaff and the Nevada border. My sergeant used to joke that nothing exciting ever happened on a Wednesday night in November, and for the most part, he was right. I'd spent the better part of 2013 writing speeding tickets and helping stranded motorists with flat tires. My daughter had just turned 6 that fall, and I'd been pulling extra shifts to save up for her birthday trip to Disneyland the following summer. The job had become routine, comfortable even, which is probably why I almost dismissed the alert when it came through on my automated license plate reader around 2 in the morning. The system pinged with that sharp electronic beep that always made my coffee jump in the cup holder. A silver 2007 Ford Taurus had just passed my position, heading westbound. The plate came back registered to a vehicle connected to a missing persons investigation out of Indiana. Not a warrant, not a stolen vehicle report, just a flag in the system asking officers to make contact and report. I'd gotten maybe 3 or 4 of these alerts in my entire career, and they usually turned out to be clerical errors or family members who'd taken off voluntarily, and someone filed a report anyway. Still, protocol was protocol. I flipped on my lights and pulled out onto the highway, watching the Taurus's brake lights flare red in the darkness ahead. The car didn't speed up or try to run. It just drifted smoothly onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires, and came to a complete stop with the turn signal still blinking. That should have been my first hint that something was seriously wrong, because normal people panic a little when they see those lights. This driver had been expecting it. I approached the vehicle with my flashlight, doing the standard scan of the interior through the back window before I got to the driver's side. What I saw made me stop mid-step. The back seat was completely gutted. No upholstery, no fabric, just bare metal framework and springs exposed like the skeleton of some animal. Every window, front and back, had this reflective silver material taped to the inside, the kind of emergency blanket stuff you see in survival kits. It caught my flashlight beam and threw it back at me in fragmented patterns. Through the gaps in the material, I could make out shapes in the back. Duffel bags maybe, and something that looked like chains bundled up on the floor. My hand went to my radio instinctively, but I didn't call it in yet. Sometimes people lived out of their cars, and maybe this guy was just some eccentric traveler with weird modifications. That's what I tried to tell myself as I reached the driver's window and tapped on the glass with my knuckles. The window rolled down, and the smell hit me first. Not the usual car odors of fast food or air freshener, but something chemical and sharp, like industrial cleaner mixed with sweat. The driver was a white male, maybe in his early 40s, with thinning brown hair plastered to his forehead. But it was his face that made my pulse pick up. Deep purple bruises spread across his left cheek and temple, fresh enough that the edges were still that ugly yellow-green color. His right eye was bloodshot, the white turned completely red like a blood vessel had burst. More bruises ringed his neck, finger-shaped marks that looked like someone had tried to strangle him. He wore a stained gray hoodie with the sleeves pushed up, revealing more bruising on his forearms, defensive wounds crisscrossing his skin. Despite all this, he smiled at me. Not nervous, not guilty, just tired. "Evening, officer," he said, his voice hoarse and raspy. "I figured you'd pull me over sooner or later." I asked for his license and registration, keeping my voice steady even though every instinct was screaming at me to call for backup right then. He handed them over without hesitation. Movements slow and deliberate, like he didn't want to spook me. The license read Gregory Allen Brenner, address in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Same state as the missing persons flag. I shined my light past him into the passenger seat and saw a clipboard with what looked like printed photographs paper-clipped to forms. The kind of documentation you'd see in official paperwork. "Mr. Brenner," I said, "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. Keep your hands where I can see them." He nodded, that same exhausted compliance, and opened his door. When he stood up, I noticed he was limping, favoring his left leg. He positioned himself against the side of the car without me having to tell him, hands flat on the roof like he'd done this before. While I patted him down, I asked about the bruises. He didn't flinch when I touched his ribs, even though I could feel the swelling through his hoodie. "Got into it with a runner 2 days ago in Pennsylvania," he said, matter of fact. Kid was stronger than he looked. 17 years old and built like a linebacker. Had to use pepper spray to get him secured. Runner. That word hung in the air between us. I stepped back and told him to turn around slowly. "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Brenner?" He met my eyes, and there was nothing deceptive in his expression, just bone-deep weariness. "I recover runaway teenagers for their families," he said. "Private contracts, mostly through a service based out of Ohio. Parents hire the company when their kids take off and the police can't help fast enough. I locate them, make contact, and transport them back home. It's legal work, officer. I have all the documentation in the car. Signed parental consent forms, photographs, last known locations, everything." That's when I called for backup. Something about the way he said it, so rehearsed and clinical, made my gut twist. While we waited for my partner to arrive, I asked Brenner about the modifications to his vehicle. He explained each one like he was describing features on a work truck. The stripped back seat made it easier to clean and disinfect between transports. The reflective material on the windows prevented runners from signaling to people outside or breaking the glass to escape. The reinforced trunk, he claimed, was for secure storage of personal belongings so the teenagers couldn't access anything dangerous during transport. "They get violent sometimes," he added, touching the bruise on his face, "especially the ones who've been on the street for months. They don't understand I'm trying to help them get home." My partner, Officer Janet Kurtz, arrived within 10 minutes and immediately radioed for a supervisor when she saw the state of the vehicle. Brenner remained calm throughout, leaning against the hood with his arms crossed, watching us with that tired, patient expression. We searched the car with Brenner's permission, and what we found made the situation exponentially worse. In the trunk, underneath a heavy wool blanket, we discovered a metal toolbox containing zip ties, duct tape, a taser, two-way radios, and a locked leather pouch that Brenner said held medical sedatives. "For extreme cases," he explained when Kurtz held up the pouch. "When they're a danger to themselves or others during transport. I have a standing prescription from a doctor who works with the company." The clipboard from the front seat contained files on 6 different teenagers, each with a professional photograph, physical descriptions, known associates, and locations where they'd been spotted. 3 of the files had red stamps across them reading, "Recovered." The other 3 were still active. One of them, a 16-year-old girl named Cassidy from South Bend, had a note scrawled in the margin. "Last seen Sunday near truck stop, Reno area. Confirmed sighting, proceed with caution, has knife." The photograph showed a blonde teenager with a nose piercing and scared eyes. My supervisor, Sergeant Dalton, arrived with 2 more units and immediately separated Brenner from us to conduct his own interview. While that happened, Kurtz and I started making calls. The company Brenner mentioned, Homeward Solutions LLC, existed and had a website advertising family reunification services. But when we contacted the Ohio Attorney General's office, things started unraveling fast. They had no record of any legitimate bail enforcement or recovery agency operating under that name. The business license had been registered just 8 months prior using a P.O. box address. When we ran Brenner's background, we found 2 prior arrests in Illinois for unlawful restraint that had been pleaded down to misdemeanors. He'd also been fired from a bail bonds company in 2009 for using excessive force on a skip. None of this matched his story of being a professional family service contractor. The parental consent forms in his files looked official enough, but the signatures were all variations of the same handwriting style, and none of the phone numbers listed for the parents connected to working lines. What really broke the case open was the missing persons database. When we cross-referenced the names and photos from Brenner's files, 4 of the 6 teenagers were listed as endangered runaways with active investigations. But here's the thing that still makes my skin prickle when I think about it. None of the families in those reports had ever hired anyone to find their kids. In fact, 2 of the families specifically told investigators they'd been contacted by someone claiming to have information about their children's whereabouts in exchange for payment. One mother in Wisconsin had wired $3,000 to Homeward Solutions before losing contact with them entirely. The girl in that file, 14-year-old Bethany, had been missing for 7 weeks when we pulled Brenner over. We found her jacket in his trunk, along with a prepaid cell phone containing text messages discussing pickup locations and delivery fees. The messages referenced other drivers, other vehicles, and what they called collection zones in truck stops and bus stations across 5 different states. Brenner was arrested on the spot and charged with kidnapping, extortion, and interstate transportation of minors. He didn't resist, didn't lawyer up immediately, just kept insisting he was doing honest work for desperate families. During processing, he gave up names of 3 other drivers working the same circuit, along with the identity of the man running the operation, a former private investigator named Carl Novak, who'd been operating out of a storage unit in Dayton. The FBI got involved within hours because of the multi-state nature of the crimes. What they uncovered was worse than any of us anticipated. Novak had been running this scheme for at least 2 years, targeting vulnerable runaways who'd already been reported missing. His drivers would locate these kids at shelters, street corners, anywhere they congregated, then either lure them with promises of help or simply grab them when the opportunity presented itself. Some were held in the modified vehicles for days while Novak contacted families pretending to be a legitimate recovery service. If families paid, the kids would sometimes actually be returned, traumatized, but alive. If families couldn't pay or refused, the teenagers would be abandoned in random locations far from where they'd been taken, or worse, sold to other criminal networks Novak had connections with. The case took 8 months to fully investigate and prosecute. They recovered 11 teenagers in total, including Cassidy, who was found at a motel outside Reno 3 days after we arrested Brenner. She'd been locked in his trunk for 6 hours during a transport before he stopped for the night and moved her to a room he'd paid for in cash. Bethany was found safe with relatives in Florida, placed there by another one of Novak's drivers who apparently had some remaining conscience, and dropped her somewhere she'd be cared for instead of following orders. Brenner got 18 years federal prison. Novak got 35. The other drivers received sentences ranging from 8 to 22 years depending on their level of involvement. I testified at 3 separate trials, and every time I had to look at those files again, at those scared faces in the photographs, I felt sick. The thing that stays with me most isn't even the violence or the cruelty of it all. It's how mundane Brenner made it sound that night on the highway. How he genuinely seemed to believe he was providing a service. That's what evil looks like sometimes. Not some monster in the shadows. Just an exhausted man in a stained hoodie who's convinced himself that what he's doing is justified. I still patrol that same stretch of highway, but I don't dismiss those automated alerts anymore, no matter how routine they seem. I'd been doing highway maintenance work for nearly 8 years, mostly night shifts when that case hit the news. Back then, I was covering long overnight drives between small towns, usually alone, checking cameras and road barriers. That stretch of road had always been quiet. Long flat miles, distant lights from gas stations, and the occasional convoy of trucks humming in the dark. My life revolved around coffee from vending machines, static from the radio, and the comfort of routine. It was the kind of monotony that made you start noticing every detail, how the fog hung low over the fields, how the asphalt changed tone under different kinds of headlights. The night it happened, I wasn't far. About 10 minutes before the report came in, I was parked near an emergency pull-off, logging some barrier replacements on my tablet. Out of habit, I kept the radio on the local patrol frequency. When dispatch called in a sedan crash near one of the overpasses, the tone in their voice made me sit up. They mentioned the driver was unresponsive, and something about impact from above. My first thought was that maybe a trucker had dropped cargo, but that explanation didn't last long once I heard they'd closed the entire span of the bridge. I drove out there before they even asked for road crew assistance. The scene looked wrong in that cold fluorescent glare. Cones scattered, paramedics crouched by a car that had veered halfway into the grass. The windshield was shattered inward, glass sparkling like frost under the lights. A patrol officer I knew, Carter, waved me back when I got too close. He just shook his head when I asked if the driver was okay. I remember noticing the dent on the hood. It wasn't from a collision with another car. It was small and deep, as if someone had dropped a cinder block from above. Later that morning, when the footage started circulating between departments, curiosity got the better of me. The dash cam from that sedan showed exactly what they said: a dark shape falling from the bridge just before the impact. No one visible on the structure. Nothing showing where it came from. But the next day, another call came in. Different highway, same pattern. And by the third, it wasn't a coincidence anymore. Someone, or several someones, was targeting random cars for some kind of twisted online stunt. When the task force got involved, I was asked to assist with inspecting the bridges along my route. I'd seen a lot of strange things on those night shifts. Accidents, wildlife, even the occasional person wandering along the shoulder. But this felt different. The officers were tense, quiet, and always looking up. Each bridge we checked carried that same uneasy silence, like the air itself remembered what had happened there. On one overpass, I found a small pile of gravel stacked neatly near the edge, like someone had been preparing ammunition. It was the kind of detail you'd overlook if you weren't paying attention. Word spread fast in nearby towns. People started avoiding the highway after dark, and the local news ran every segment they could. Some treated it like gossip, others like a ghost story. Then came the videos. Short clips surfacing online of masked kids throwing debris and laughing as headlights swerved below. Most were fake or re-uploaded pranks, but a few matched the timing and locations of the real incidents. That's when it stopped feeling like an isolated crime, and more like something coordinated, maybe even celebrated. One night, I was called out again. Another report near a bridge about 15 miles from the first crash. By the time I arrived, the suspect was already in custody. He couldn't have been more than 17. What I'll never forget is the look on the officer's face standing next to him. Carter, the same guy from the first scene. He kept his eyes on the ground as the kid was loaded into the patrol car. Only later did I learn that boy was his son. It explained the silence that hung over the investigation afterward, the way everyone avoided mentioning names. A week later, when the reports were filed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The attacks had been planned over a private group chat, a challenge that promised viral fame to whoever caused the biggest wreck. Every clip, every timestamp, every shared laugh, it was all there. Carter went on leave not long after, and that stretch of highway was fitted with new cameras and metal nets under the bridges. Still, even now, when I drive those roads at night, I catch myself scanning the overpasses out of habit. Sometimes I swear I see movement up there, just a flicker, like someone leaning over the railing, waiting. A few months passed, and the highway slowly returned to normal traffic. The memorial cross for the first victim stayed on the shoulder, surrounded by faded flowers and empty bottles left by strangers. I'd drive past it during my shifts, always slowing down a little. It became a quiet reminder of how quickly something senseless could change everything. The investigation wrapped up without much media coverage after that. Most people just moved on. But for those of us who worked those nights, the silence never really went away. One evening, during a storm, I had to inspect one of the bridges we'd reinforced. Rain was hammering so hard it blurred the guardrails into streaks of gray. When I stepped out of the truck, I saw something sitting near the edge. A chunk of concrete about the size of a football, resting perfectly in the center of the walkway. It looked fresh, like it had been placed there minutes earlier. There were no footprints, no tire marks on the shoulder. Just the sound of rain and the echo of water dripping through the cracks. I radioed it in, and they sent a unit to sweep the area. Nothing came of it, of course. The footage showed no one approaching the bridge for hours before I got there. Still, for weeks afterward, the spotlights under that overpass stayed on every night, cutting through the dark like warning eyes. Drivers probably thought it was just another safety measure. I knew better. It was there because some part of us couldn't trust that it was truly over. I left that job a year later and took a position closer to home. But I still drive those same roads sometimes out of habit, watching the lights of the bridges fade in the distance. Every now and then, I think about Carter's kid and the twisted chain of dares that started it all. The internet forgot, like it always does, but I can't. Whenever a gust of wind rattles my windshield, I glance up at the overpasses without even realizing it. You'd think after all this time I'd stop expecting to see someone up there, but I never do. Not clearly, anyway. When I joined the patrol, I used to love the early morning shifts, the kind of quiet stretches where the fog hung low, and the only sounds were my own tires rolling over wet asphalt. That night, I was halfway through my shift when dispatch came through with a call that didn't sound right. A woman's voice, shaky and muffled, claiming she was on the shoulder and that someone had tried to take her. The connection kept cutting out, just fragments of sentences and the soft sound of her breathing, like she was trying not to be heard. The dispatcher flagged it as high priority because the area had poor reception and no backup nearby. I was the closest unit, about 15 minutes out, and the kind of silence that followed the last transmission made the hair on my arms rise. I remember driving through the fog and feeling how the world seemed smaller, swallowed up by that pale gray. Visibility was maybe 30 feet at best. My cruiser headlights barely cut through, turning the mist into a glowing wall ahead of me. I slowed near the marker where the call had pinged, rolling the window down to listen. Nothing but the hum of the engine and the faraway hiss of traffic. Then faintly, movement. A shape walking along the shoulder, drenched, shivering, her hands held close to her chest like she was trying to warm herself. I pulled over, hit the lights, and stepped out, calling to her. She looked up at me, face pale, strands of wet hair plastered to her forehead. Her voice came out in bursts, between shallow breaths. She said she'd been kidnapped, managed to get away when her abductor pulled off onto a side road, and that his vehicle was still there. She kept pointing toward the tree line where the fog thickened like smoke. I noted her condition, soaked, trembling, barefoot, wearing a torn dress that clung to her. No ID, no bag. My training kicked in. Keep distance, stay alert, get details. I radioed dispatch, but all I got was static, a scratchy half-response that dissolved into noise. She urged me to follow her, said the man was probably still there, maybe hurt. The urgency in her eyes made me hesitate. Something about her kept shifting, not physically, but in the way she looked at me. 1 second desperate, the next oddly calm. I tried my radio again, switched channels, and caught fragments of something else, a voice repeating phrases almost identical to what she'd said a minute ago. "Please help me. He's still there." The same tone, the same pauses, like a recording playing just out of sync. My stomach tightened. I drew a breath, glanced back at the highway, still empty, and decided to follow her a few steps off the shoulder, my hand resting on my flashlight. The turnoff she led me to was barely visible through the fog, just a narrow path of gravel curving between overgrown brush. My boots sank into the soft mud as I stepped past the guardrail. The air smelled metallic, like rain and old engine oil. She kept glancing over her shoulder, whispering that the car was right there, but every time I looked where she pointed, there was nothing but mist. Then something flickered in my peripheral vision. A red glint, maybe a taillight gone as quickly as it appeared. I angled my flashlight, catching the outline of a scarf tangled on a low branch. It looked new but damp, like someone had deliberately set it there. I called out, asking for her name, trying to ground the situation, but she didn't answer. When I turned around, she was standing farther away than before, near the bend where the gravel disappeared into darkness. The fog swallowed her figure up to the waist, her outline blurred like a smudge on glass. I stepped closer, but before I could say anything, my radio cracked to life. A burst of feedback, then a familiar voice. Mine. My own voice, repeating the words I'd said minutes earlier when I'd first arrived. The same tone, the same background noise. It didn't make sense. I froze in place, listening as the static warped back into silence. I switched frequencies, trying to reach dispatch again, and got a different transmission. Faint crying, distant and repetitive, like someone replaying a short clip on a loop. It wasn't coming from my radio anymore. It was coming from somewhere nearby. A muffled echo drifting through the fog. My flashlight caught a glimmer of something small on the ground. A child's sneaker, perfectly clean, as if it had never touched mud. The placement was too deliberate. It felt staged, like pieces being laid out to guide me deeper in. I scanned the area, scanning the fog for movement, and realized how quiet it had become. No wind, no insects, no highway noise. Just me. Instinct told me to pull back, regroup, call for backup from a safer distance. But then my phone buzzed with a map notification, the shared location from the emergency call. I glanced at it, and the pin was moving, jumping erratically between 2 points. One near my cruiser, the other farther down the turnoff. It kept switching back and forth, as if someone wanted me to chase it. I turned toward the direction of the second point, and that's when I saw it. A faint silhouette crouched behind a cluster of bushes, not moving, not running, just waiting, watching me through the fog. I kept the beam steady, scanning the shape ahead. The crouched figure didn't move, not even when I called out. My thumb hovered near the safety clip on my holster, every nerve on alert. I took one cautious step forward. That was when a faint metallic tap echoed behind me. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, catching the edge of something reflective near my cruiser's lights in the distance. The instant I looked back, the silhouette was gone. I couldn't see where it went, but the fog shifted slightly, like air displaced by movement. My pulse thudded in my ears, and I realized I'd lost sight of the woman entirely. My training told me to return to the vehicle, but curiosity and protocol fought inside me. What if someone really was hurt out there? I moved a few steps deeper down the turnoff. A dim glow appeared through the mist, headlights angled downward, half buried in brush. The car was there after all. The driver's door was open, the interior lights flickering weakly. I announced myself, cleared the immediate area, then leaned in to look. The seats were empty, but the floor was littered with small objects, coins, a hair tie, an empty water bottle, all too clean, too carefully scattered. A faint smell of gasoline hung in the air. Then from my radio again came a voice I recognized, my dispatcher, but it was wrong. The timing of her speech was off, each word clipped and mechanical. Unit 3-1, confirm status. I answered, but the line crackled and her voice continued repeating the same sentence, even as I spoke. Layered under it was another faint sound, whispers, too low to distinguish, moving in and out of the static. It felt like multiple transmissions stitched together. My instinct screamed that I was being baited, pulled deeper into something orchestrated. I backed away from the car, scanning the tree line again. As I reached for my flashlight belt, my boot hit something. A folded paper map, half buried in the mud. It wasn't weathered like you'd expect. When I picked it up, I saw a red circle drawn around the very area I was standing in. The ink hadn't run from the rain. My location, marked ahead of time. Every small detail, the scarf, the sneaker, even the scattered items in the car, started connecting in my head. This wasn't random. Someone had planned this down to the minute. The fog seemed heavier now, pressing close, and somewhere out there, just past where I could see, a low engine turned over. The sound of that engine cut straight through the fog, a low rumble that idled for a moment, then stopped. I turned my light in the direction it came from, but there was nothing but a wall of mist. My cruiser's lights were barely visible through the haze behind me. I decided to move back toward the highway, keeping my flashlight low and my hand close to my sidearm. Each step on the gravel felt loud, like I was announcing my location. Halfway back, I caught another flicker of movement, someone darting between the trees to my left, too fast to track. I shouted a warning, identified myself as law enforcement, but the woods answered with silence. When I finally reached the edge of the shoulder, I saw a second pair of headlights through the fog. Backup. Relief hit me so hard I almost laughed, until I noticed they were angled wrong, not approaching from the interstate, but already parked there facing mine. A black SUV, engine running, no markings. Its driver's door was ajar, interior dark. I called out again, voice firm, but got no response. The wind shifted then and I could smell something, the same gasoline scent, stronger this time. That's when the dispatcher's voice returned, crystal clear, saying my unit number, but this time she used my first name. Only she didn't know my first name. I cut the radio immediately, stepped behind my cruiser for cover and drew my weapon. The SUV headlights dimmed slightly, like someone had just stepped in front of them. For a few seconds, all I could hear was the ticking of my engine cooling down. Then came the faint scrape of shoes on asphalt. One figure, maybe two, walking slowly along the shoulder toward me. I shouted commands. No reply. My light caught only fragments, the glint of wet fabric, a hand partially raised, a shadow moving just out of focus. And then the sound stopped. The SUV engine cut. Silence again, heavy enough that I could hear my heartbeat. Later, investigators said I was lucky. Another unit found me about 20 minutes after my last transmission, standing by my cruiser, weapon drawn, still sweeping the fog. The SUV was gone. So was the woman. The only evidence left were footprints, several sets, circling my patrol car before vanishing into the brush. The victim's phone, the one used to make the call, was later found 2 counties away, wiped clean except for one saved audio clip. My own voice, distorted and replaying the same few words I'd spoken when I first arrived. Whoever they were, they knew exactly how to lure an officer alone into the dark. Nobody tells you how loud silence can be, until you find yourself surrounded by nothing but frozen emptiness. My name is irrelevant now, but what happened to me in March 2018 changed everything about how I understand survival, fear, and the absolute indifference of nature. At 34, fresh off a divorce that had gutted my savings and my sense of self, I had taken a contract job with a telecommunications company installing satellite equipment in remote Alaskan villages. The pay was exceptional, the kind of money that made you overlook the fact that you would be flying in tiny aircraft over landscapes that looked like they belonged on another planet. I had grown up in suburban Minnesota, spent my 20s chasing a career in network engineering, and somehow ended up agreeing to spend 6 weeks bouncing between communities that most Americans could not find on a map. The irony of running away from one kind of isolation straight into another was not lost on me. But desperation makes you brave in stupid ways. The morning of the crash started like any other workday in that strange chapter of my life. I woke up at 5 in the morning in a small motel in Bethel, a hub town in southwestern Alaska that served as my base of operations. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and stale coffee, and frost had crystallized on the inside of the single window, despite the heater running all night. My pilot for the day was a guy named Dean Archer, a wiry man in his early 50s with sun-damaged skin, and the kind of calm demeanor that either meant he was incredibly competent or completely checked out. He had been flying bush routes for over 2 decades, and when I met him at the airstrip that morning, he was already doing his pre-flight check on a Cessna 185 that looked like it had seen better days. The paint was faded, patches of primer showing through in spots, but Dean assured me she was mechanically sound. We were headed to a village called Akiak, about 40 miles northeast, then continuing to 2 other communities before looping back. The whole trip was supposed to take 6 hours, weather permitting. We took off around 7:30, just as the sun was beginning to paint the horizon in shades of pale orange and pink. From the air, the Alaskan tundra in late winter is something that defies description. An endless white canvas broken only by dark ribbons of frozen rivers, and the occasional cluster of spruce trees that looked like black needles poking through a bedsheet. Dean was not much of a talker, which suited me fine. He communicated in short bursts, pointing out landmarks, mentioning changes in weather patterns, occasionally adjusting the radio to check in with other pilots in the area. The Cessna hummed along steadily, and despite the cramped quarters and the constant vibration that made my teeth feel loose, I found myself relaxing into the rhythm of the flight. We completed the first 2 stops without incident, me hauling my equipment cases through snow that came up to my knees, Dean smoking cigarettes by the plane, and chatting with locals who seemed to know him by name. By early afternoon, we were headed to our final destination before turning back, a village called Tuluxac that sat along the Kuskokwim River. That is when the engine coughed. It was a sound so subtle that I almost missed it, a brief stutter in the constant drone that had become background noise. Dean's reaction told me everything I needed to know. His hands tightened on the yoke, and his eyes flicked to the instrument panel with an intensity that had been absent all day. He did not say anything at first, just started flipping switches and adjusting controls with movements that were quick but deliberate. The engine coughed again, longer this time, and the plane shuddered in a way that made my stomach clench. We were flying over a stretch of wilderness that had no villages, no roads, nothing but white emptiness stretching to the horizon in every direction. Dean grabbed the radio and started transmitting our position, his voice steady but urgent, using terminology I did not fully understand. I remember looking out the window and seeing the shadow of our plane skating across the snow below, and thinking how small we were, how insignificant against that vast frozen landscape. The engine sputtered a 3rd time, then died completely, and the sudden silence was the most terrifying sound I've ever heard. Dean became a different person in those moments. The laid-back pilot who had been cracking dry jokes about moose and complaining about his ex-wife transformed into something mechanical, precise, almost robotic. He told me to tighten my seatbelt and brace for impact, his voice flat and controlled, like he was reading from a manual. The Cessna became a glider, the only sounds now the wind rushing past the fuselage and the creak of the airframe as Dean fought to maintain control. He was looking for a place to land, scanning the terrain below with desperate focus. But there was nothing. No frozen lakes flat enough, no clearings wide enough, just rolling hills of snow and clusters of willows, and the occasional boulder poking through like a gray tooth. I remember praying, something I had not done since childhood, bargaining with a God I was not sure I believed in. The ground rushed up at us with sickening speed, and Dean pulled back on the yoke, trying to flatten our descent. We clipped something, a buried log, a snowdrift, I never found out, and the plane spun violently to the left. The world became a tumbling chaos of white and gray, and the shriek of metal tearing apart. The impact itself is fragmented in my memory, broken into snapshots that do not quite connect. I remember the windshield exploding inward, a spray of glass and snow and cold air hitting my face. I remember the sensation of being thrown forward against my restraint so hard that the breath was crushed out of my lungs. I remember a sound like a giant crumpling a tin can, and then a sharp, blinding pain in my left leg that made me scream. When everything stopped moving, I was hanging sideways in my seat, the plane resting at an angle with the crumpled nose buried in a snowbank. Blood was dripping somewhere. I could hear it, a soft pattering sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden stillness. My vision swam in and out of focus, and for a long moment I just hung there, trying to understand what had happened, trying to remember how to breathe. The cold was already seeping in through the shattered windshield, a cold so intense it felt like being stabbed with thousands of tiny needles. I turned my head to look at Dean, and that is when I saw that he was not moving. His body slumped forward against the yoke, a dark stain spreading across the snow beneath his door. Getting out of that seatbelt took what felt like an eternity. My fingers were already going numb, fumbling with the release mechanism while my legs screamed in protest every time I shifted my weight. When I finally got free, I half fell, half crawled toward Dean, dragging myself across the tilted cabin floor that was now slick with hydraulic fluid and melting snow. Up close, I could see the damage. A piece of the instrument panel had broken loose during impact and caught him in the chest, and there was so much blood soaking through his jacket that I knew before I even checked for a pulse. Dean Archer, who had flown these routes for 23 years, who had told me just that morning about his daughter's wedding coming up in June, was dead. I sat there in the wreckage next to his body, shivering uncontrollably, my breath coming out in ragged white clouds, and I felt something inside me threaten to crack wide open, but the cold would not let me grieve. It demanded action, demanded movement, demanded that I focus on the only thing that mattered now, not dying in this frozen nowhere alongside a man I had known for less than 8 hours. I forced myself to assess the situation with whatever clarity I could muster through the shock and the pain. My left leg was badly injured. I could see the bone pressing against the skin just below my knee, not broken through but close, the whole limb swelling rapidly and turning colors that legs should not turn. I had cuts on my face and hands from the shattered windshield, and my ribs ached in a way that suggested at least one was cracked. The plane was destroyed beyond any hope of repair, but the fuselage was mostly intact, which meant shelter of a sort. Outside, the temperature was somewhere around 15 below zero, and the sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. In March, this far north, we only had maybe 5 hours of usable daylight left. I crawled to the back of the cabin where my equipment cases had been stored and found them scattered and broken open, satellite components and tools strewn everywhere. But underneath the wreckage, I found my backpack with a spare jacket, 2 granola bars, a thermos of coffee that was somehow still intact, and a cigarette lighter I had been carrying even though I quit smoking 3 years prior. Not much, not nearly enough, but something. The hours that followed exist in my memory as a blur of pain, cold, and desperate improvisation. I knew from the survival training the company had given us, a half-day seminar that I'd mostly slept through, that staying with the aircraft was the right call. The wreckage would be easier for search teams to spot than a single person wandering through the wilderness, and the fuselage offered at least some protection from the wind that had started to pick up, driving the temperature even lower. I used pieces of torn insulation in my spare jacket to plug the hole where the windshield had been, working with fingers that had lost most of their feeling, cursing and crying and talking to myself just to fill the terrible silence. Dean's body was still in the pilot seat, and I could not bring myself to move him, so I just tried not to look in that direction. The radio was destroyed, crushed in the impact along with most of the instrument panel. I found the emergency locator transmitter under the rear seat, but the casing was cracked, and the indicator light that should have been blinking was dark and dead. Our last known position had been transmitted before we went down, but Dean had been in the middle of giving coordinates when the engine failed. I had no idea if anyone knew where we were, or if they were even looking yet. The sun set around 6 in the evening, and the darkness that followed was unlike anything I had experienced before. In Minnesota, even on the darkest winter nights, there was always some ambient light, street lamps, distant highways, the glow of civilization on the horizon. Out here, there was nothing. The blackness was so complete that I could not see my hand in front of my face, and the only sounds were the wind howling across the tundra and the occasional groan of the aircraft's twisted frame settling in the snow. I rationed the coffee, taking small sips to keep my core temperature up, and ate half of one granola bar, even though I had no appetite. My leg had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, and the pain had evolved from sharp and immediate to a deep, pulsing throb that synced with my heartbeat. I knew that was bad. The body going into shock, blood pooling in damaged tissue, the beginning of a process that could kill me just as surely as the cold. I tried to elevate the leg, propping it on one of the equipment cases, and I wrapped it as tightly as I could with strips torn from the cabin seat covers. Sleep was impossible. Every time I started to drift off, the cold would jolt me awake, or the pain would spike, or I would hear something outside, real or imagined, that sent my heart racing. Dawn came slowly, a gradual lightening of the darkness that felt like a small miracle. I had survived the night, though I was not sure how much longer I could hold on. My leg had turned a mottled purple-black color that terrified me, and I had stopped being able to feel my toes sometime around 3 in the morning. The second granola bar went down in small bites, washed down with the last of the cold coffee, and I tried to make a plan. Movement was nearly impossible. Every attempt to put weight on my injured leg sent bolts of agony shooting up into my hip and made my vision go white at the edges. But staying still meant freezing, meant letting hypothermia creep deeper into my body with every passing hour. I decided to try and make some kind of signal, something that searchers might see from the air. Using the lighter and some of the aircraft's insulation material, I managed to start a small fire in a metal container I had salvaged from the wreckage. The smoke rose in a thin gray column against the pale sky, and I fed it with whatever I could find. Pieces of fabric, paper from the flight manual, strips of plastic that sent up black plumes. It was pitiful, really. A tiny thread of smoke in an endless white wilderness. But it was something to focus on, something to do besides lie there and wait for death. The second day passed in a haze of pain and cold and creeping despair. I talked to Dean's body, apologizing for things that made no sense, telling him about my failed marriage and my estranged sister, and the dog I had left with my ex-wife. I hallucinated at some point, saw my mother standing outside the shattered windshield, wearing the yellow dress she had been buried in, asking me why I had not called more often. The fire went out, and I could not get it started again. My fingers too clumsy, my coordination too far gone. I noticed that I had stopped shivering, and some distant part of my brain remembered that this was a very bad sign, that shivering was the body's way of generating heat, and when it stopped it meant you were in the final stages of hypothermia. I thought about giving up. The idea floated through my mind with a strange serenity. Just close my eyes, let the cold take me, stop fighting against something that was clearly inevitable. I probably would have done it too. I was ready. But then I heard it, faint but unmistakable, cutting through the wind and the fog in my brain, the distant thump of helicopter rotors. I do not remember much of what happened next, just fragments and sensations. I remember trying to wave, to make some kind of movement that would catch their attention, but my arms felt like they belonged to someone else. I remember the helicopter getting louder, circling overhead, and the overwhelming relief that flooded through me when I realized they had seen the wreckage. I remember voices, hands reaching for me, the painful brightness of a flashlight in my eyes. Someone was asking me questions, my name, where I was hurt, how long I had been out there, but my mouth would not form the words. They cut me out of the fuselage with tools that screamed and sparked, and then I was being lifted onto a stretcher, strapped down, carried through the snow toward the waiting helicopter. The warmth inside the aircraft hit me like a physical blow, and I started crying without meaning to, tears freezing on my cheeks before someone wiped them away. A paramedic was working on my leg, cutting away the makeshift bandages I had wrapped around it, and I saw his face go pale when he saw what was underneath. He said something to his partner that I could not hear over the rotor noise. But the look they exchanged told me everything. They put an IV in my arm and covered me with thermal blankets that felt like being wrapped in fire, and at some point I finally let myself slip into unconsciousness. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Anchorage, missing my left leg below the knee. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive, that another few hours in that cold would have finished what the crash had started. The rescue team had found me thanks to a combination of factors. Dean's partial transmission had given them a general search area. A pilot flying a different route had spotted the smoke from my signal fire the previous day, and the Alaska State Troopers had coordinated a search effort that covered hundreds of square miles. They told me that Dean had died on impact, that he probably never felt any pain, and I choose to believe that even though I know they might have been saying it just to make me feel better. The company paid for my medical bills and my rehabilitation, and I got a settlement that was generous enough to let me start over somewhere warmer. I live in New Mexico now, working a desk job for a different telecommunications company, and I have not been on an airplane of any size since that day in March 2018. Sometimes I still dream about it. The endless white, the cold that felt like it was eating me from the inside out, the sound of Dean's last radio transmission cutting off mid-sentence. I wake up sweating despite the desert heat, reaching for a leg that is no longer there, and I have to remind myself that I made it out. That I survived. But a part of me is still out there in that frozen wilderness, sitting in the wreckage of a Cessna 185, watching the sun set and wondering if anyone is coming. That part of me never left, and I do not think it ever will. After my college graduation in 2015, my best friends and I made a pact to take one big adventure together before life pulled us in different directions. Mitch had just finished his EMT certification, and Carrie was about to start law school in September, so we had this narrow window in late August to do something wild. Alaska seemed perfect, raw, remote, untouched. Mitch had a cousin who worked on a fishing boat near Valdez, and he told us about this abandoned hunting lodge, about 40 miles from the nearest town, deep in the Chugach Mountains. The place had been closed since the early 90s, after the owner died, and nobody claimed the property. We figured we would hike out there, spend a couple of nights, take some photos, maybe see some wildlife. None of us could have imagined what was waiting in that rotting wooden structure, or that only 2 of us would make it back to civilization. We flew into Anchorage on a Thursday morning, rented a Jeep, and drove 6 hours to a small town called Copper Junction. Just a gas station, a general store, and maybe 15 houses scattered along a gravel road. The woman at the general store, a weathered lady in her 60s named Ruth, looked at us like we had announced plans to swim with sharks when we mentioned the old Whitaker Lodge. She told us people avoided that area, that hikers had reported seeing figures moving through the trees at night, strange lights, things that made no sense. Her exact words were that the forest out there had a way of playing tricks on your mind. Mitch laughed it off, called it small-town superstition designed to scare tourists. Carrie and I exchanged a look but said nothing. We bought extra batteries, some canned food, and a paper map since cell service would be non-existent. Ruth watched us leave through the store window, and I remember thinking she looked almost sad, like she was watching people walk toward something terrible, and knew there was nothing she could do to stop it. The hike took us nearly 7 hours. The trail, if you could even call it that, disappeared completely after the first 2 miles, and we had to navigate using the map and a compass Mitch brought. The Chugach Mountains are beautiful in a way that feels almost hostile, like the land is reminding you every second that you do not belong there. Spruce trees so thick you could walk 10 feet off the path and lose sight of your friends. Silence so deep that the snap of a twig under your boot sounds like a gunshot. Around mile 6, Carrie spotted something strange carved into a tree trunk, a crude symbol that looked like a stick figure with its arms raised, and below it, letters scratched deep into the bark. Turn back. We stood there staring at it for a long moment. Mitch said it was probably some bored hiker trying to scare people, maybe the same locals who told ghost stories to tourists. But the carving looked old, the edges worn smooth by years of weather. And there was something desperate about those letters, like whoever made them had used a rock or a knife and pressed hard, wanting to make sure the message would last. We reached the lodge just before sunset. The building was larger than I expected. A 2-story structure with a wraparound porch, most of the windows either broken or boarded up, the roof sagging in the middle like a spine that had given up. Moss covered everything, and there was this smell, thick and sour, that I assumed was just decades of rot and animal droppings. Mitch was the first one through the front door, which hung crooked on its hinges and scraped against the floor when he pushed it open. Inside, the main room still had furniture, a couch with the stuffing torn out, a wooden table covered in dust, a stone fireplace filled with old ashes. But what stopped all three of us in our tracks was the kitchen area in the back corner. There were cans of food on the counter, and not old rusted ones from the 90s. These labels were modern, brands I recognized, and when Carrie picked one up, she whispered that the expiration date was still a year away. Someone had been here recently. Someone might still be here. We should have turned around right then, hiked back through the darkness if we had to. But we were tired. It was getting dark fast, and Mitch convinced us that it was probably just another group of hikers who had passed through. We decided to stay the night and leave at first light. That decision haunts me every single day. We set up our sleeping bags in the main room near the fireplace, figuring it was the safest spot since we could see both the front door and the stairs leading to the second floor. Mitch got a small fire going using some dry wood we found stacked behind the couch, another detail that should have alarmed us more than it did, because who stacks firewood in an abandoned building? Carrie was quiet, kept glancing toward the dark hallway that led to what looked like storage rooms in the back. Around 9, she said she needed to use the bathroom and grabbed her flashlight. The outhouse was about 30 yards behind the lodge, a tilted wooden box that somehow still stood despite looking ready to collapse. She was gone for maybe 10 minutes when we heard her scream. Not a startled yelp, but a real scream, the kind that carries pure terror in it. Mitch and I grabbed our flashlights and ran outside, calling her name, our beams cutting through the darkness. We found her standing behind the outhouse, flashlight pointed at the ground, her whole body trembling. She could barely get the words out. She kept saying there were bones, human bones, and when I looked down, I saw them too. A scattered pile of what was unmistakably a human rib cage, a femur, fragments of a skull half buried in the dirt. The bones were not fresh, but they were not ancient either. Some still had dried tissue clinging to them. Mitch tried to stay calm, said it could be anything, maybe a hunter who got lost and died of exposure years ago. But Carrie pointed her flashlight a few feet to the left, and there was another pile, and another beyond that. At least 4 distinct groupings of human remains, all within a 20-foot radius of that outhouse, like someone had been dumping bodies there for years. The smell I had noticed earlier, the one I blamed on rot and animals, it suddenly made a different kind of sense. We needed to leave immediately. All of us agreed on that. But it was pitch black now and the trail was impossible to navigate at night. One wrong step and you could fall into a ravine, or walk in circles until exhaustion took you. Mitch said we would barricade ourselves inside, take shifts staying awake, and leave the second the sun came up. We dragged the heavy wooden table against the front door and pushed the couch against the back entrance. Carrie found a rusty hunting knife in one of the drawers and held onto it like her life depended on it, because at that point, we all understood it might. None of us slept. We sat in a triangle facing outward, flashlights ready, listening to every creak and groan of that old building, waiting for morning. Around 3 in the morning, we heard footsteps on the porch. Not animal footsteps. These were heavy, deliberate, human. They moved slowly from one end to the other, paused near the boarded window, then continued around the side of the building. Mitch grabbed a thick piece of firewood and positioned himself near the front door. Carrie had the knife raised, her knuckles white around the handle. I held my flashlight like a weapon, which felt pathetic, but it was all I had. The footsteps stopped at the back entrance, and then came 3 slow knocks on the door. 1, 2, 3. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Then a voice, low and gravelly, muffled through the wood. "I know you're in there. I saw your fire." My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Mitch whispered for us to stay quiet. Maybe whoever it was would leave if we did not respond. For a long moment there was silence. Then the voice again, closer now, like the person had pressed their face against the door. "This is my home. You're sleeping in my home." The handle jiggled. The couch we had pushed against the door shifted an inch. Carrie let out a small whimper, and I grabbed her arm, squeezing hard, begging her silently to stay quiet. The jiggling stopped. The footsteps retreated, slow and unhurried, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world. We heard them circle the building once more, then fade into the forest. For the next 2 hours, nothing. Just the wind and the occasional crack of branches in the distance. By 5, the sky started to lighten, and we made the decision to run. We grabbed our packs, left everything else, and Mitch pulled the table away from the front door. He opened it slowly, checking both directions, and motioned for us to follow. We made it maybe 50 yards into the tree line when Carrie suddenly stopped and pointed back toward the lodge. There was a man standing on the porch, watching us. He was tall, gaunt, with a beard that hung past his chest and clothes so filthy they looked like they had fused to his skin. He did not move, did not chase us, just stood there with his arms at his sides, his head tilted slightly to one side like a curious dog. And then he smiled. Not a threatening smile, but something worse, something empty and patient, like he knew exactly where we were going and had no doubt he would find us again. We ran. We ran faster than I have ever run in my life, branches whipping our faces, rocks twisting under our feet, not daring to look back. We had been moving for maybe an hour when Mitch stopped and said he needed to check the map. We were lost. Nothing looked familiar, and in our panic we had veered completely off the route we had marked the day before. The forest was dense here, the trees so close together that sunlight barely penetrated, and everything looked the same in every direction. Carrie was crying quietly, trying to muffle the sound with her sleeve. I kept scanning the trees behind us, expecting to see that gaunt figure emerge at any moment. Mitch spread the map on a fallen log and tried to orient us using the compass, but his hands were unsteady and the needle kept jumping. That is when we heard it. A sharp whistle, high-pitched and deliberate, coming from somewhere to our left. Then another whistle answered from the right, and a third from behind us. There was more than one person out there. The man at the lodge was not alone. Mitch shoved the map in his pack and grabbed Carrie by the arm, pulling her forward. We picked a direction and moved as fast as we could, trying to stay quiet but knowing that whoever was out there already knew exactly where we were. The whistles continued, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, like they were hurting us somewhere specific. Around midday, we stumbled into a small clearing and found another carved message on a tree. This one was newer, the letters still pale against the dark bark. "No one comes." Below it, scratched in smaller, shakier writing, "He keeps us here." Carrie started hyperventilating, and I had to hold her face in my hands and force her to look at me, to breathe with me, to stay focused. Mitch was pacing the edge of the clearing, looking for any sign of a trail, when the attack came. The man appeared from nowhere. Not the bearded one from the lodge, but someone younger, faster, wearing torn military fatigues and carrying a length of rusted chain. He swung it at Mitch before any of us could react, catching him across the back of the shoulders and sending him sprawling into the dirt. Carrie screamed and lunged with her knife, slashing wildly, and caught the attacker across the forearm. He howled and stumbled backward, giving Mitch enough time to scramble to his feet. I grabbed a rock the size of my fist and threw it as hard as I could, hitting the man in the chest. He looked at me with these pale, empty eyes, not angry, not pained, just hollow, and then retreated into the trees as quickly as he had appeared. Mitch was bleeding through his shirt, deep welts already forming where the chain had struck. We had to keep moving. For the next 3 hours, we pushed through the forest with no real sense of direction, just desperate to put distance between us and whoever was hunting us. Mitch was slowing down, the pain in his back making every step a struggle, and Carrie had gone silent in a way that scared me more than her crying had. The whistles had stopped, which somehow felt worse, like they had decided to let us exhaust ourselves before closing in. Around 4 in the afternoon, I heard something that made me want to collapse with relief. The sound of running water. We followed it and found a river, maybe 30 feet wide, moving fast with snowmelt from the mountains. I remembered from the map that a river ran near the main road about 15 miles from where we had started. If we followed it downstream, we might find civilization. We waded in, the cold shocking the breath out of us, and let the current carry us as much as we could manage while keeping our footing. Mitch slipped twice, and the second time Carrie and I had to drag him up before the water pulled him under. We stayed in that river for what felt like hours, our legs going numb, our teeth chattering so hard I thought they might crack. But nobody followed us into the water. Whatever advantage they had in the forest, the river took it away. Just before sunset, we saw a bridge in the distance. A real bridge, concrete and metal, with a gravel road running across it. We climbed out of the river on shaking legs and stumbled up the embankment to the road. A pickup truck came by within 20 minutes, driven by a man named Earl who took one look at us and did not ask questions, just told us to get in. He drove us straight to a state trooper station in a town called Ridgewater, about 60 miles from Copper Junction. We told them everything: the lodge, the bones, the man on the porch, the whistles, the attack. They listened with expressions that shifted from skepticism to something darker as we spoke. One of the troopers, a woman with gray streaks in her hair, finally said they had been looking for a man named Vernon Crisp for almost 8 years. He had escaped from a corrections facility in 2007, serving time for multiple counts of kidnapping and assault. They had assumed he fled to Canada or died in the wilderness. Instead, he had built himself a compound out there, attracting other fugitives, other broken men who wanted to disappear. The trooper said they had received reports over the years, hikers talking about ghosts in the forest, strange figures, carved warnings, but nobody had ever come back with enough information to launch a real search. Until us. The raid happened 3 days later. State troopers, FBI, search and rescue teams. They went in with helicopters and dogs and enough manpower to sweep every inch of that mountain. They found Vernon Crisp in the lodge, sitting in a chair by the fireplace like he had been expecting them. He did not resist. The 2 other men they captured in the surrounding forest put up more of a fight, but both were taken alive. What they found behind that lodge was worse than anything we had seen. 17 sets of remains, some dating back to the late 90s, others much more recent. They also found a root cellar about 100 yards from the main building, dug into the hillside and hidden by brush. Inside were journals, dozens of them, written by people who had been kept there, some for weeks, some for months. The entries described everything: the captures, the isolation, the way Vernon would release them into the forest and hunt them for sport, the way some prisoners were forced to help him in exchange for their lives. Those carved warnings we had seen on the trees were made by the ones who managed to escape the cellar briefly, desperate attempts to warn anyone who might come after them. Most of those people never made it out of the forest. Their bones ended up behind the outhouse with all the others. Mitch spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from an infection that developed in his wounds. Carrie finished law school but changed her focus to victims advocacy. She works with families of missing persons now, helps them navigate the system when the police stop looking. I still live in the same apartment I had before Alaska, still work the same job, still see the same people. But something fundamental broke inside me during those hours in the forest. I check the locks on my doors 4 or 5 times before I can sleep. I cannot hear a whistle without my chest tightening. And sometimes, late at night, I think about Ruth at that general store, how she tried to warn us and we laughed it off as superstition. The ghosts she talked about were real. They were just made of flesh and bone, like us. That is the thing nobody tells you about monsters. They do not need to be supernatural to destroy you. They just need to be patient and hidden, and willing to wait for the next group of people who think the wilderness is empty. It never is. I know that now. I will never forget it. Every summer since my dad passed, I make the trip up to the Kenai Peninsula to fish for sockeye salmon. It started as a way to feel close to him again, doing something we used to do together when I was a teenager. But over the years, it became my thing. my way of resetting before another school year of teaching fourth graders in Seattle. My birthday falls in late July, and turning 37 alone on a riverbank with nothing but the sound of rushing water and birdsong felt like exactly what I needed. I had been doing this solo trip for 6 years without any real incident. A few close calls with moose, one scary moment when I slipped on wet rocks and almost went into the current, but nothing that made me question whether I should keep coming back. The spot I always use is about 4 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a trail that most people skip because there are easier fishing spots closer to civilization. That remoteness was always the appeal. I flew into Anchorage on a Tuesday morning and picked up my rental truck, a beat-up Ford that smelled like cigarettes and prior renters who did not believe in air freshener. The drive down to the peninsula took about 4 hours, and I stopped in Soldotna to grab last-minute supplies and check in with the ranger station like I always do. The guy working the desk, a younger ranger I had not seen before, warned me about increased bear activity in the area. He said the salmon run was strong this year, which meant the browns were coming down from higher elevations earlier than usual. I thanked him and told him I had bear spray and air horn and knew how to store my food properly. He gave me this look, not condescending exactly, but like he wanted to say something more and decided against it. I wish now that I had asked him what he was thinking. I wish I had paid more attention to the weight behind that look, instead of brushing it off as a ranger doing his job. The hike in took me about 2.5 hours with my pack, which was heavier than usual, because I had brought extra food for a 5-day stay. I reached my usual campsite around 4 in the afternoon, plenty of daylight left to set up, and maybe get a few casts in before dinner. The spot sits on a slight rise about 60 feet from the riverbank, sheltered by a thick stand of spruce trees on 3 sides. The river curves there, creating a natural pool where the salmon tend to gather before pushing upstream. I had caught my limit here every single year. I set up my tent, hung my food cache from the bare wire that someone had installed years ago between 2 tall spruces, and took a walk down to the water to check conditions. The river was running a bit higher than I remembered from previous years, probably from snowmelt, and the water had that murky, glacial color that makes it hard to see more than a few inches below the surface. I noticed fish jumping out near the middle of the current, silver flashes catching the late afternoon sun, and I felt that familiar excitement in my chest. That first evening was perfect. I caught 3 nice sockeyes before the light started fading, kept 2 and released 1, and cooked dinner on my little camp stove while listening to the river. I did everything right with my food prep, cleaned the fish downstream from my camp, washed my hands and arms thoroughly, changed into clean clothes that I kept sealed in a dry bag. I was careful. I am always careful. Around 10, which is still pretty bright that far north in July, I noticed movement on the opposite bank. Maybe 200 yards away, a large brown shape moving through the brush. I could not see it clearly, but I knew what it was from the way it moved, that distinctive rolling gait. It did not seem interested in me, just working its way along the far shore, probably fishing in its own spots. I watched until it disappeared into the trees. Then I got into my tent and zipped everything up tight. I remember thinking how lucky I was to see one from a safe distance. I remember feeling grateful, not scared. I woke up around 3 in the morning to the sound of something moving through the brush near my tent. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the undergrowth maybe 30 or 40 feet away. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I lay completely still, barely breathing, my hand wrapped around the bear spray I always keep next to my sleeping bag. The footsteps circled. I could track them by sound, moving from the tree line behind my tent toward the river, then back again. At one point they stopped, and I heard this sound, a deep huffing breath followed by a low grunt. It was close enough that I could smell it, that musky, wet dog smell mixed with something rotten, probably fish. I do not know how long I lay there, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Eventually, the sounds moved off toward the river and I heard splashing in the distance. I did not sleep again that night. I just lay there with my eyes open, listening to every small noise, my body so tense that my muscles ached by morning. When the sun came up around 5, I got out of my tent to check the area. My legs were shaky and I felt that sick exhaustion you get when adrenaline has been pumping through you for hours. The ground near the tree line was torn up, deep gouges in the soft earth where something had been digging. And then I saw the tracks. They were massive, bigger than any bear print I had ever seen in my 6 years of coming here. I put my boot next to one of them for reference, and the print was easily twice the size of my foot, with claw marks extending several inches beyond the toe pads. I am not a wildlife expert, but I have seen enough brown bear tracks to know that this was an unusually large animal. The tracks led from the woods to a spot maybe 20 feet from my tent, circled around, and then headed down toward the river. I stood there looking at how close they came to where I had been sleeping, separated by nothing but a thin layer of nylon, and I seriously considered packing up and hiking out right then, but I talked myself out of it. That is what I keep coming back to, that moment of decision. I told myself the bear was just passing through, that it had not tried to get into my food cache, that it was probably more interested in the salmon than in me. I told myself I had driven 8 hours and hiked 4 miles, and I was not going to let one close encounter ruin my trip. I checked my food hang, which was untouched, and I made noise while I cooked breakfast, banging pots together and talking loudly to myself like all the guides recommend. I even did some fishing that morning, though I stayed closer to camp than usual, and kept my bear spray clipped to my waders at all times. I caught 1 salmon and released it because I did not want to deal with cleaning fish and creating more smells. The whole time I was on the water, I kept scanning the banks, the tree line, the bend in the river where I had seen the bear the night before. Nothing. The day was bright and warm, birds singing, river flowing, and I started to relax a little. I started to think maybe I had overreacted. Around 2 in the afternoon, I was sitting on a rock near the water, eating a granola bar and resting my feet when I saw it. The bear emerged from the brush on my side of the river, maybe 150 yards upstream. It was enormous, easily the biggest brown bear I had ever seen outside of photographs. Its fur was dark brown, almost chocolate-colored, with a distinctive silver patch on its shoulder. It walked to the water's edge and stood there, and then it turned its head and looked directly at me. I want to be clear about this because it matters. The bear saw me. It knew I was there. And instead of doing what bears usually do when they encounter humans, instead of running away or at least moving off, it started walking toward me along the riverbank. Not charging, not running, just walking. Steady and deliberate, like it had somewhere to be and I was on the path. I stood up slowly and grabbed my bear spray with one hand and my air horn with the other. I started backing away from the river toward my campsite, keeping the bear in my sight the whole time. I pressed the air horn, and the blast echoed across the water, loud enough to hurt my ears. The bear paused for a second, maybe 2, then kept coming. I yelled and waved my arms over my head, trying to make myself look bigger. Nothing. It just kept that same steady pace, closing the distance between us. 75 yards now, maybe less. I could see its face clearly. The small dark eyes, the dish-shaped profile, the way its ears were pointed forward with focus and intent. My brain was screaming at me to run, but I knew that was the worst thing I could do. You cannot outrun a brown bear. You cannot outswim one either. I kept backing up, stumbling over rocks and roots, and I hit the air horn again, 3 short blasts. The bear did not even flinch. It reached the spot where I had been sitting and it stopped there, sniffing the rock, sniffing the ground where I had dropped my granola bar wrapper. And then it lifted its head and looked at me again, and it made this sound, a low rumbling grunt that I felt in my chest more than heard. I do not know what made me decide to go for the river. Maybe some survival instinct kicked in, or maybe I just panicked and made a stupid choice. My campsite was behind me, but the bear was between me and the trail that led back to the road. The river was to my left, and on the other side of the river was more wilderness, but at least it was distance. At least it was something. The bear started moving again, faster now, and I turned and ran for the water. The cold hit me like a wall when I plunged in, that glacial runoff so cold it locks up your muscles and steals your breath. I was only in up to my waist, but the current was strong, pulling at me, and I could barely feel my legs. I pushed forward, half swimming and half wading, trying to reach the far bank. I heard splashing behind me, and I did not look back. I just kept going, my arms numb and clumsy in the freezing water. The riverbed was all loose rocks and sudden drop-offs, and twice I went under, swallowing water that tasted like ice and silt. When I finally dragged myself onto the opposite bank, I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. I turned around, expecting to see the bear swimming after me or already on my side of the river. But it was just standing at the edge of the water on the far bank, right where I had gone in, watching me. It did not try to follow, it just stood there, and after a minute or two it turned and walked back toward my campsite, disappearing into the trees near where my tent was set up. I was soaking wet, freezing, starting to feel that dangerous sleepiness that comes with hypothermia. And all my gear, my food, my truck keys, my phone, everything was on the other side of the river, with a bear that had just chased me into glacial water. I had my bear spray still clutched in my hand, but that was it. No dry clothes, no fire starter, no way to call for help. I started walking downstream along the bank, trying to keep moving, trying to generate body heat. I knew there was a fishing lodge about 6 miles downriver. I had seen it on my map when planning the trip. 6 miles through dense brush and uneven terrain in wet clothes with the temperature dropping as evening approached. I did not think about whether I could make it. I just walked. It took me almost 5 hours to reach that lodge. By the time I stumbled out of the tree line and a guest spotted me, I could not feel my feet and my lips were blue. They wrapped me in blankets and called for a medical helicopter because my core temperature had dropped to 92 degrees, which is apparently when organs start having trouble. I spent 2 nights in a hospital in Anchorage being treated for moderate hypothermia and mild frostbite on 3 of my toes. The Rangers went back to my campsite the next day and found my tent shredded, my food cache pulled down from the wire and scattered everywhere. They found tracks all around the site, the same massive prints I had seen that morning. They told me later that there had been reports of a large male brown bear in that area, exhibiting unusually bold behavior around humans, possibly because someone had been feeding it earlier in the season. They never caught it as far as I know. I still go fishing every summer, but not there, never there again. And every time I see a bear in the distance now, even in a zoo, I feel my chest tighten and I remember that steady walk along the riverbank, those small, dark eyes fixed on me. And I remember how it feels to be looked at not as a threat or a curiosity, but as something else entirely. November in Alaska feels like the world is slowly dying, and that particular November felt worse than most. I had been covering crime stories for the Anchorage Daily Herald since my journalism school graduation back in 2009, staying in this frozen corner of the country because the isolation bred stories nobody else wanted to touch. My editor dropped a folder on my desk containing 6 missing persons cases spanning 15 years, all connected to an abandoned copper mine called Raven Shaft near a forgotten town named Ketchum Falls. The mine had been closed since 1987 after a collapse killed 4 workers, but hikers and amateur explorers kept wandering in over the decades. None of them came back out. Local authorities had stopped sending search parties after the 3rd disappearance because the cave system was too unstable, too deep, and too cold. The families never got answers. The cases went cold, and something about that silence made me volunteer to investigate. I spent 3 weeks researching before I ever set foot near that mountain. The mine entrance sat about 40 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a rough trail that became impassable once the heavy snow arrived in December. I connected with a geological survey team from the University of Fairbanks, who had been trying to get funding to map the cave system for years. Their leader was a woman named Ingrid Solberg, maybe 50 years old with sun-damaged skin and a handshake that could crush walnuts. She had lost a graduate student to Raven Shaft in 2014 and had been petitioning the state to either seal the entrance permanently or fund a proper documentation expedition. When I told her about the article I wanted to write, she offered me something better than an interview. She invited me to join a 5-person team heading into the mine that Friday to recover whatever evidence they could find before winter sealed the mountain for good. I said yes without hesitating, which, looking back, was the first of many mistakes. Our team assembled at a ranger station about 20 miles from the site on a Friday morning, so cold that my breath crystallized on my eyelashes. Besides Ingrid and myself, there was her colleague Desmond Yates, a soft-spoken geologist in his early 60s who had mapped caves across 3 continents, and 2 younger researchers named Cynthia Park and Jonah Fielding. Cynthia handled the audio and video documentation equipment, a serious woman with cropped black hair who barely spoke during the drive-up. Jonah was the safety coordinator, responsible for the ropes, the harnesses, and the emergency protocols that I prayed we would never need. He had this nervous habit of checking his gear over and over, running his fingers along the carabiners like rosary beads. The ranger who met us was a grizzled man named Cliff Bjornson, who had been stationed in this region for over 20 years. He made us sign liability waivers that essentially said the state of Alaska bore no responsibility if we died in that hole. He also told us that if we were not back by nightfall, nobody was coming to find us until spring. The hike to Raven Shaft took nearly 4 hours through terrain that wanted to kill us with every step. The trail, if you could call it that, wound through dense spruce forest before climbing a rocky slope scattered with loose shale and patches of black ice. Ingrid led the way with the confidence of someone who had made this journey before, though I noticed her pace slow as we approached the final ridge. The mine entrance appeared suddenly, a dark wound in the gray mountainside framed by rotting timber supports that had somehow survived decades of harsh winters. A faded warning sign hung crooked from a rusted chain, the words barely legible beneath layers of grime and lichen. The opening was maybe 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, sloping downward at a steep angle into absolute darkness. Standing there, feeling the cold air rushing up from the depths like the mountain was exhaling, I understood why people called this place cursed. Not because of anything supernatural, but because it felt hungry in a way that only truly dangerous places can feel. We descended into Raven Shaft just after noon, roped together in a line with Jonah at the front and Desmond bringing up the rear. The temperature dropped dramatically within the first 100 feet, and the quality of darkness changed from the soft gray of an overcast day to something thicker, something that seemed to press against our headlamps like a living thing. The main shaft angled downward for about 300 meters before opening into a large chamber that the original miners had used as a staging area. Rusted equipment still littered the floor. Pickaxes and ore carts and coils of ancient rope turned brittle with age. Our boots crunched on a mixture of gravel and ice crystals that had formed over decades of water seeping through microscopic cracks in the rock. Ingrid pointed her light toward the far end of the chamber, where 3 tunnels branched off into different directions, each one disappearing into its own private darkness. She explained that the left tunnel led to the collapsed section where the 4 miners had died in 1987. The middle tunnel went deeper into the mountain, descending another 200 meters before dead-ending at a flooded shaft. The right tunnel was where most of the missing persons had last been seen, according to the sparse evidence that search teams had recovered over the years. We took the right tunnel, moving slowly and carefully along a path that grew narrower with every step. The walls were slick with moisture, and in several places we had to duck beneath rock formations that jutted down like broken teeth. Cynthia documented everything with her camera, capturing the strange beauty and the undeniable menace of a place that had swallowed so many people whole. About 40 minutes into the tunnel, Jonah stopped us with a raised fist. His headlamp had caught something reflective ahead, wedged between 2 rocks near the base of the wall. He crouched down and pulled out a hiking boot, faded orange with a distinctive zigzag pattern on the sole. Inside the boot, still laced tight, was a wool sock. Ingrid checked her files and confirmed that the boot matched the description of gear worn by a hiker named Russell Adkins, a 24-year-old college student who had entered Raven Shaft alone in 2016 and never returned. We found only the one boot, no sign of the other, and no sign of Russell. Cynthia photographed the discovery from multiple angles while I stood there wondering what kind of circumstances would cause someone to leave behind a single boot in a place like this. The tunnel opened into a second chamber about an hour later, smaller than the first but with a higher ceiling that disappeared beyond the reach of our lights. This room felt different immediately, and it took me a moment to understand why. There were signs of habitation everywhere. A sleeping bag lay unrolled against the far wall, its fabric torn and stained with something dark that could have been mud or could have been blood. Nearby sat a camping stove, 2 empty water bottles, a scattered pile of energy bar wrappers, and a backpack with its contents dumped across the stone floor. Ingrid approached the scene carefully, instructing everyone to stay back until she could assess the situation. She crouched beside the backpack and read the name embroidered on its strap aloud. Gretchen Moody. According to Ingrid's research, Gretchen had been part of a group of 4 amateur spelunkers who entered Raven Shaft in October of 2017. The group had planned a 2-day exploration and packed supplies accordingly. When they failed to return after 5 days, authorities mounted a limited search that recovered nothing. Now we were looking at proof that at least one of them had survived long enough to set up camp deep inside this mountain. Desmond found the audio recorder tucked inside a crevice near the sleeping bag, protected from the elements by an overhang of rock. It was a small digital device, the kind hikers use to document their journeys, and miraculously, the battery still held a faint charge. Ingrid wanted to wait until we returned to the surface to examine the contents, but Cynthia argued that we needed to know what we were dealing with before going any deeper. The group voted, and curiosity won. We gathered in a loose circle, while Cynthia connected the recorder to a portable speaker she carried in her kit. The first file was dated October 17, 2017, recorded in the cheerful voice of a young woman who introduced herself as Gretchen. She described the group's excitement about exploring a cave system that few people had ever documented. The other voices in the background belonged to her companions, a man named Isaac, another woman named Shelley, and a 4th member whose name I could not quite make out through the static. They sounded happy. They sounded alive. And somehow knowing what came next made listening to those first innocent minutes almost unbearable. The second recording was made 2 days later, and the change in tone was immediate. Gretchen's voice trembled as she explained that a rockfall had blocked their exit route. Isaac had tried to find an alternate path but returned after several hours with bad news. Every passage they explored either dead-ended or looped back to the same chamber. Their food was running low. Their flashlight batteries were failing one by one. Shelley had injured her ankle during the initial collapse and could barely walk. The 4th member, whose name was finally clear in this recording as Bo, kept insisting that he had heard movement somewhere deeper in the tunnels. Not animals, he said. Footsteps. Human footsteps. The others dismissed him as paranoid, but Gretchen's voice carried a note of doubt that suggested she was not entirely convinced. The recording ended abruptly with the sound of something falling in the distance, followed by Shelley screaming, and then silence. We sat in that cold chamber, 5 people huddled around a speaker, listening to the echoes of a nightmare that had played out in this exact spot years before we arrived. The third recording was the worst. Gretchen spoke in a whisper, her words rushed and broken by long pauses where she seemed to be listening for something. 6 days had passed since the collapse. Isaac was dead. She did not explain how or why, only that it had happened during an argument about their remaining water supply. Bo had disappeared into one of the side tunnels 2 days earlier and never came back. Shelley's ankle had become infected, and she spent most of her time unconscious, burning with fever. Gretchen described the darkness as a weight pressing down on her chest, the silence broken only by Shelley's labored breathing, and the constant drip of water somewhere in the distance. She mentioned the footsteps again. Bo had been right, she said. Someone else was in these tunnels. She had heard them too, always just beyond the reach of her dying flashlight, always moving away when she called out. She begged whoever found this recording to tell her mother that she had tried to survive. She begged them to bring her body home. The recording ended with a sound that none of us could identify, a low, scraping noise that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, followed by Gretchen whispering a single word that sounded like "run." Nobody spoke for a long time after the recordings ended. Ingrid finally broke the silence by announcing that we had collected enough evidence and needed to begin our ascent before we lost too much daylight. I noticed that her hands moved with a new urgency as she packed the recorder into a protective case. Jonah started organizing our gear for the return journey, counting heads as he always did before any movement. He counted twice, then a third time. His face went pale in the harsh white light of our headlamps, and he asked a question that turned my insides to ice. Where was Desmond? We all looked around the chamber, calling his name into the darkness, our voices bouncing off the wet stone walls and returning to us distorted and strange. Desmond had been standing at the edge of the group just minutes ago, examining some markings on the wall near the tunnel entrance. Now that spot was empty. His pack lay on the ground where he had set it down, but the man himself had vanished without a sound. Cynthia pointed her camera light toward the tunnel we had entered through, then toward two smaller passages on the opposite side of the chamber that we had not yet explored. Nothing. No movement. No answer to our increasingly frantic calls. Jonah wanted to search immediately, but Ingrid overruled him with a voice that shook despite her efforts to remain calm. She reminded us of the protocols we had all agreed to before entering the mine. If someone became separated, the group would mark the location, return to the surface, and contact authorities with proper rescue equipment. Going deeper into an unstable cave system to search for a missing person was exactly how more people ended up dead. I understood her logic, but standing there in that chamber surrounded by the belongings of people who had died alone in the dark, the thought of leaving Desmond behind felt monstrous. We compromised. Jonah and I would check the two unexplored passages for exactly 5 minutes each, while Ingrid and Cynthia stayed at the camp to maintain a light beacon. The first passage curved sharply after about 30 feet and ended in a wall of collapsed rubble that looked decades old. The second passage went deeper, angling downward at a steep grade, and about 100 feet in, my headlamp caught something that stopped me cold. A footprint in the mud. Fresh. Pointing away from the chamber, heading deeper into the mountain, the tread pattern matched the boots Desmond had been wearing. I called his name one more time, my voice swallowed by the tunnel ahead. Nothing came back except a faint echo and something else. Something that might have been the wind moving through cracks in the rock, or might have been breathing. Jonah grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the chamber. Our 5 minutes were up. When we returned to Ingrid and Cynthia, I told them about the footprint, expecting Ingrid to change her mind about the search. Instead, her expression hardened into something I recognized from years of interviewing people who had made impossible choices. She said that Desmond knew the risks better than any of us. She said that if he had walked deeper into that tunnel on his own, there was a reason, and if he had been taken, then whatever took him was still down there with us. Either way, 3 more bodies would not bring him home. We gathered what evidence we could carry, including Gretchen's recorder and the photographs Cynthia had taken, and we began our ascent. The climb back to the surface felt twice as long as the descent. Every sound made us flinch. Every shadow seemed to move at the edges of our lights. I kept looking back, hoping to see Desmond's familiar silhouette catching up to us, but the darkness behind remained absolute and empty. We emerged from Ravenshaft just as the last gray light of day was fading from the sky. Cliff Bjornsson was waiting at the ranger station with coffee and questions. When we told him about Desmond, his face registered no surprise, only a weary kind of resignation that suggested he had heard this story before. He made calls to the state police and the search and rescue coordinator, but I could tell from his tone that nobody expected a recovery operation. The official report, which I obtained months later through a records request, concluded that Desmond Yates had likely become disoriented in the cave system and fallen into one of the many unmapped shafts that riddled the lower levels. His body was never recovered, The entrance to Raven Shaft was sealed with concrete and steel bars the following spring, and a new sign was erected warning that trespassers would face criminal prosecution. I published my article in February, though the editors cut most of the details about the recordings and focused instead on the broader issue of abandoned mine safety. The families of the missing contacted me for months afterward, desperate for any information I had not included in the story. I told them what I could. I did not tell them about the footsteps that Gretchen heard, or about the fresh boot print leading into darkness, or about the sound I heard just before Jonah pulled me back from that tunnel. A sound like someone whispering my name from very far away, in a voice that almost sounded like Desmond. My truck died somewhere between Tok and Delta Junction on a stretch of highway that looked exactly like the last 100 miles. White, flat, and empty. The temperature gauge had been showing -47 for the past hour, and I remember thinking that number seemed almost fake, like something from a documentary about Antarctica, rather than a road I was actually driving on. I had taken this relocation job from Seattle to Fairbanks because the salary was too good to pass up, and my 10-year high school reunion a few months back had been a reminder that everyone I grew up with was buying houses and having kids while I was still splitting rent with roommates. The plan seemed reasonable when I mapped it out. Drive the Alaska Highway in early December, get settled before the holidays, start fresh in January. I had packed blankets, extra food, flares, a full tank of gas, everything the internet told me to bring. But sitting there watching my dashboard light up with warnings before the engine gave one last shudder and went silent, I understood that all the preparation in the world means nothing when you are alone in a place that wants to kill you. I turned the key again and again, maybe 20 times, and each attempt produced a weaker sound until there was nothing but a faint click that reminded me of a dying heartbeat. The heating system stopped the moment the engine quit, and I could feel the cold pushing into the cabin almost immediately, like it had been pressed against the windows just waiting for its chance. I grabbed my phone knowing there would be no signal, and I was right. No bars, no data, nothing but a useless rectangle of glass and metal. Outside, the sun hung low even though my watch said it was barely 2 in the afternoon. That strange Arctic winter light that looks more like a permanent sunset than actual daytime. I figured I had maybe 3 hours before full darkness, and the thought of spending a night in this truck with no heat made my chest tight. I looked out at the road in both directions and saw absolutely nothing. No cars, no buildings, no smoke from distant chimneys, just an endless white plain broken only by the dark line of asphalt disappearing into the horizon. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own pulse in my ears, and for the first time since I started this drive, I felt genuinely afraid. I tried to remember what I had read about survival in extreme cold. Stay with your vehicle. That was the main advice everywhere online. Your car is shelter, it is visible to rescuers, it protects you from wind. But the articles I had read were written for situations where someone might actually come looking for you, where the temperature was maybe -20 and you could survive a night bundled up in blankets. This was different. At -47, the math changes completely. I had read somewhere that exposed skin gets frostbite in under 5 minutes at these temperatures, that your core body temperature starts dropping almost immediately once you stop producing heat. The blankets I had brought were good for a camping trip, not for a night in an unheated metal box when the air itself feels like it is trying to freeze your lungs. I did the calculation in my head. If no one drove by tonight, and the temperature dropped even further after dark like it always does, I would be dead by morning. That was not pessimism, that was just physics. I remembered passing a sign about 30 minutes back, something about a highway maintenance station 8 miles ahead. At the time I barely noticed it, just another green rectangle on an endless road. Now that sign felt like a lifeline, the only piece of information that might save me. 8 miles was not that far. I had run half marathons before, back when I lived in Seattle, and thought jogging along the waterfront made me some kind of athlete. But 8 miles in this cold, in snow boots and a jacket designed for Pacific Northwest rain rather than Arctic winter, with the sun going down, and no guarantee that the station would even be staffed. That was something else entirely. I sat in the truck for another 10 minutes, watching the windows start to frost over from the inside, feeling my fingers getting stiff even with gloves on. The decision made itself. Staying meant certain death by morning. Walking meant maybe dying, but also maybe living. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with the granola bars and water bottles I had brought, wrapped a scarf around my face until only my eyes were exposed, and stepped out of the truck into cold that hit me like a physical wall. The first breath I took outside felt like inhaling broken glass. The air was so cold that my nostrils stuck together for a second, and I had to breathe through my mouth just to get oxygen in. My eyes watered immediately, and I could feel the moisture trying to freeze on my eyelashes, turning them stiff and clumped. I started walking north along the highway, keeping the asphalt under my feet because I knew that wandering off into the snow would mean losing my sense of direction within minutes. The snow on the road had been packed down by whatever sparse traffic came through, but it was still slippery, and each step required concentration. I told myself to keep a steady pace, not too fast because sweating would be deadly. I had read that wet clothing in extreme cold is basically a death sentence, that the moisture pulls heat from your body faster than the air alone ever could. So I walked like I was on a casual stroll, except every part of my body was screaming that something was wrong, that I should be running, that I needed to get somewhere warm right now. After maybe 20 minutes, I started to notice that I could not feel my toes anymore. I was wearing 2 pairs of socks and my heaviest boots, the ones I had bought specifically for this trip, and none of it mattered. The cold had found a way in, like it always does, creeping through the rubber soles and the insulation and the wool until my feet felt like blocks of wood at the end of my legs. I kept walking because stopping was not an option, but I started doing this thing where I would curl my toes inside my boots, trying to force blood into them, trying to feel anything at all. My fingers were next, even inside the gloves, even tucked into my jacket pockets. The tips went numb first, then the knuckles. Then that numb feeling started creeping up toward my wrists. I checked my watch and realized I had been walking for almost 40 minutes, which meant I had covered maybe 2 miles at most. The maintenance station was still 6 miles away, and the sun had dropped noticeably lower, painting everything in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if they did not mean I was running out of time. Around the 1-hour mark, something changed in my head. I noticed it happening, which is the strange part. I was aware that my thoughts were getting slower, like my brain was a computer running too many programs at once. I would start thinking about something, like how far I had walked or whether I should eat one of the granola bars, and then I would just lose the thread of it completely. I found myself stopping in the middle of the road for no reason, just standing there staring at the horizon, and I had to physically force myself to start moving again. My body wanted to stop. Every cell in me was saying, just sit down for a minute, just rest, just take a break. I knew that was the hypothermia talking, that sitting down meant dying, but knowing something and feeling something are 2 completely different things when your core temperature is dropping and your brain is not getting enough warm blood. I started talking to myself out loud, just to have something to focus on, just to keep my mind from drifting into that soft gray fog that kept trying to swallow my thoughts. The road started to look different after a while, or maybe I was just seeing it differently. I could have sworn there was a building up ahead at one point, a dark shape against the snow, and I walked faster toward it for maybe 5 minutes before realizing it was just a shadow, some trick of the fading light on the landscape. That scared me more than anything had so far. If I was already seeing things that were not there, how much longer before I walked off the road entirely without realizing it? The highway was my only guide, the only thing keeping me pointed in the right direction. And if I lost it, I would be wandering in circles until I collapsed. I tried to focus harder, tried to keep my eyes on the asphalt directly in front of me, but my vision kept going blurry at the edges, and I had to blink constantly to clear it. The tears would freeze almost instantly, gluing my eyelids together for a half second each time, and wiping them away with my frozen gloves just made it worse. I realized I had stopped feeling cold, which should have been a relief, but I knew it was actually a very bad sign. When you stop shivering, when the cold stops hurting, that means your body has given up trying to warm itself. That means you are in serious trouble. I do not know exactly when I left the road. That is the part that haunts me when I try to piece together what happened. The gap in my memory, where the highway just disappears, and suddenly I was walking through open snow with no idea how I got there. One moment I was following the dark line of asphalt, telling myself to keep going, keep moving, and the next I was knee-deep in powder with nothing around me but white in every direction. I must have wandered off during one of those foggy moments when my brain checked out, maybe saw another phantom building in the distance and walked toward it without thinking. I tried to turn around, tried to find the road again, but everything looked exactly the same. Flat white ground meeting gray-blue sky and a perfect circle around me, like I was standing in the center of an empty dome. I picked a direction and started walking, telling myself it had to be the right way. But even as I moved, I knew I was guessing, knew I could be walking deeper into nothing instead of back toward the highway. The sun was almost gone now, just a thin red line on the horizon, and the temperature was dropping even further. I could feel it in my chest, each breath harder than the last, like the air itself was thickening into something my lungs could not process. My legs stopped working properly somewhere in that white emptiness. First, they just felt heavy, like I was wading through water, and then they started refusing to bend the way I wanted them to. I fell twice, maybe 3 times, and getting back up took longer each time. The last time I went down, I remember lying there in the snow and thinking how soft it was, how it almost felt warm compared to the air, how maybe I could just rest here for a minute before continuing. Part of my brain was screaming at me to get up, screaming that this was exactly how people die. But that voice seemed far away now, like someone yelling from another room. I managed to push myself to my knees, then to my feet, but standing felt like an achievement that took everything I had. I looked around and realized I could not see anything anymore. Not the road, not the sun, not any landmark at all. Just darkness creeping in from every direction and the snow beneath my feet, and this incredible tiredness that made every thought feel like pushing a boulder uphill. I took a few more steps, maybe 10 or 20, and then I stopped. Not because I decided to stop, but because my body simply would not go any further. My legs locked up, my knees buckled, and I went down into the snow one final time. I woke up in a hospital in Fairbanks 3 days later, and for the first few hours I had no idea where I was or how I got there. A nurse told me that a snowplow driver found my truck on the highway and called it in, and that search and rescue teams had been looking for me since the next morning. They found my trail of footprints leading away from the vehicle, followed them for about 4 miles along the road, and then tracked where I had wandered off into the open terrain. The footprints just stopped, she said, in the middle of a flat white field about 2 miles from the highway. No body, no sign of where I went after that. They searched for hours with dogs and helicopters, expanding the radius, checking every depression in the snow. A volunteer on a snowmobile finally spotted me nearly a mile from where my tracks ended, lying face down in a shallow ditch that had been invisible from the air. My core temperature when they got me to the medical center was 26 degrees Celsius. The doctors said anything below 28 is usually fatal, that most people do not come back from that. I lost 3 toes on my left foot and 2 on my right, plus the tips of 4 fingers. The surgeon told me I was lucky, and I wanted to laugh at him, but I did not have the energy. What I cannot stop thinking about even now is that gap between where my footprints stopped and where they found me. Almost a full mile of distance with no tracks, no trail, nothing to show how I got there. The rescue team leader visited me in the hospital and admitted he had never seen anything like it. The snow was undisturbed, fresh powder that would have shown every step, but there was just nothing, like I had been picked up and set down somewhere else. He asked if I remembered walking that distance, and I told him the truth, that I do not remember anything after falling that last time until I woke up in this bed. The doctors say it was probably some kind of automatic response, my body moving on its own while my conscious mind was completely shut down. A last survival instinct that kept me crawling toward that ditch where the wind was blocked and the snow provided insulation. Maybe that is what happened. Maybe my body saved itself while I was not home. But sometimes late at night, when I look at the stumps where my toes used to be and feel the phantom ache in my missing fingertips, I wonder about those invisible steps. I wonder what part of me was still walking when the rest of me had already given up. I drove through Alaska thinking I understood cold, thinking I was prepared, and I learned that there are things about your own body and your own mind that you will never understand, not even when they save your life. Seattle had given me everything I thought I wanted: a steady job at a busy clinic, a decent apartment, friends who understood the chaos of 12-hour shifts. But somewhere around my 10th year as a nurse practitioner, the routine started to feel like a slow suffocation. I needed something different, not just a change of scenery, but a complete reset. The kind you only get when you put 1,000 miles between yourself and everything familiar. When I saw the posting for a public health position in Koyukuk, a village of about 200 people in interior Alaska, something clicked. My nursing school classmates were buying houses in the suburbs, scheduling play dates, posting photos of their kitchen renovations. Meanwhile, I was signing a 2-year contract to work in a place most people could not find on a map. The salary was decent, housing was provided, and the job description mentioned everything from wellness checks to emergency response. My mother cried when I told her. My father just shook his head and asked if I had lost my mind. I arrived in Koyukuk on the last day of August, when the tundra was still gold and rust-colored, and the daylight stretched past 9 at night. A bush plane dropped me at a gravel airstrip about half a mile from the village center, and a man named Irving Tukala picked me up in a battered pickup truck that looked older than me. Irving worked for the tribal council and had been assigned to help me settle in. He was maybe 60, with deep lines carved into his face and hands that looked like they had been shaped by decades of hard labor. He did not say much during the drive, just pointed out landmarks: the community center, the general store, the fuel depot. When we passed a cluster of houses set apart from the others, he slowed down slightly. "Moreau family," he said, his voice flat. "They keep to themselves." I nodded, not thinking much of it at the time. Small towns always have their dynamics, their unspoken boundaries. I had no idea that those 3 words would become the first thread of something I wish I had never pulled. My first few weeks went smoothly enough. The health clinic was a small building with peeling paint and equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum. But it was functional. I saw patients for everything from ear infections to diabetes management, and most people were friendly in that reserved, cautious way that comes from living in tight-knit communities. I learned to read the silences as much as the words. A woman named Ruthie Anaktavuk became my unofficial guide to village life. She worked at the general store and had a way of explaining things without making me feel like an outsider. She told me which families had been there for generations, which had arrived more recently, and which ones I should just leave alone. When I asked about the Moreaus, her face changed. Not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. "They handle their own problems," she said, and then she changed the subject to the weather forecast. I let it go, but something about her reaction stayed with me like a splinter I could not reach. It was mid-September when the first real incident happened. A young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, came into the clinic with her mother. The girl had a gash on her forearm that clearly needed stitches, deep enough that I could see the white of tissue beneath the blood. But when I started preparing the suture kit, the mother grabbed her daughter and pulled her toward the door. "We changed our minds," she said, not meeting my eyes. "It will heal on its own." I tried to explain the risk of infection, the likelihood of scarring, but she was already gone. I stood there in the empty exam room holding a needle and thread, feeling like I had just witnessed something I did not understand. When I mentioned it to Ruthie later that day, She got very quiet. "That was Celeste Moreau," she finally said. "Her daughter Elise. They do not come to the clinic, they never have." I asked her why, and she just shook her head. "Some questions are better left alone out here." October came fast, and with it the cold. Not the crisp autumn chill I knew from the Pacific Northwest, but something deeper. A cold that seemed to seep into the walls, into your bones, into your thoughts. The daylight was shrinking rapidly, and by the end of the month we had maybe 6 hours of weak sunlight before the darkness swallowed everything again. I spent more time in the clinic going through old records, partly out of boredom, and partly because the incident with the Moreau girl kept nagging at me. The filing system was a mess, decades of paper records stuffed into cabinets with no real organization. But as I started sorting through them, patterns began to emerge. Death certificates mostly. In a village this small, you expect to see deaths from the usual causes: age, accidents, the occasional illness. What I did not expect was how many of those accidents involved the same handful of family names: Moreau, Ivanov, Tulik. Over and over again. Drownings, falls, exposure, hunting mishaps. All ruled accidental by whatever authority had signed off on them, but the frequency was staggering. In the past 15 years, I counted 11 deaths among those 3 families alone. 11, in a village of 200 people. I started making a list, writing down dates and names and causes of death on a yellow legal pad I kept hidden in my desk drawer. Maybe I was paranoid, maybe I was just a city girl looking for drama in a quiet place. But then I noticed something else. The deaths were not random. They clustered around the same time each year, mostly between late October and early December, when the village was at its most isolated. When the rivers froze, but the ice was not yet thick enough for safe travel. When the bush planes stopped flying because of weather. When getting out of Koyukak became nearly impossible. I sat in my small clinic office with that legal pad in front of me, the wind howling outside, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Someone was dying in this village almost every year, right around this time, and everyone was pretending it was normal. I made the mistake of asking questions. Not directly, not at first. I thought I was being subtle. I mentioned to Irving that I had been organizing the old records and noticed a lot of accidents over the years. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then said, "Alaska is a dangerous place. People die." That was it. Conversation over. I tried a different approach with Ruthie, asking about the Ivanov and Tulik families, whether they were related to the Moreaus. She stopped stocking shelves and turned to face me with something in her eyes I had not seen before. Fear, maybe, or warning. "You are a good person," she said slowly. "You came here to help, so let me help you. Stop looking at those old papers. Stop asking about those families. Just do your job, get through the winter, and when spring comes you can decide if you want to stay or go. But right now you need to stop." Her voice was barely above a whisper by the end. I wanted to argue, to push back, but the look on her face made the words die in my throat. She was genuinely afraid, and not for herself. That night I came home to find my cabin door unlocked. I always locked it. That was a habit from Seattle that I never broke. My first thought was that maybe I had forgotten, that the isolation was getting to me. But when I stepped inside and turned on the light, I knew someone had been there. Nothing was taken. Nothing was damaged. But my desk drawers were open, and the yellow legal pad where I had been keeping my notes was sitting in the middle of my bed. It had been in my clinic office. Someone had taken it, brought it here, and left it where I would be sure to find it. A message. I picked up the pad and flipped through it. All my notes were still there. Every name and date I had written down. But on the last page, someone had added a single sentence in handwriting that was not mine. "The winter is long and accidents happen." I stood there in my freezing cabin holding that legal pad, and for the first time since I arrived in Koyukak, I felt truly afraid. Not curious, not unsettled, afraid. Because whoever wrote that note knew exactly what I had been doing, and they wanted me to know that they knew. I should have stopped. Any rational person would have stopped. But fear does strange things to you. Sometimes it paralyzes, and sometimes it pushes you to do exactly what you should not do. The next morning, I went to the tribal council office and asked to see the village census records from the past 20 years. The woman behind the desk, someone I had never spoken to before, looked at me like I had asked for the nuclear launch codes. She said the records were not available to outside contractors, that I would need special permission from the council elders. I asked how I could get that permission. She smiled without warmth and said the council only met once a month, and the next meeting was not until December. I walked out of that office knowing I had just put another target on my back. That afternoon, I tried to call my mother using the satellite phone at the community center, the only reliable way to reach the outside world. The phone was broken. It had worked fine the week before. The man who ran the center, a quiet guy named Amos Chukwu, said a part needed to be ordered and it would take a few weeks. He did not look at me when he said it. November arrived like a door slamming shut. The last supply plane came in on the 3rd, and the pilot told me the weather window was closing fast. He asked if I wanted to leave, said he could make room for one more passenger. I thought about it. I thought about the note on my bed, the broken satellite phone, the way people had started looking at me differently, like I was a problem that needed to be managed. But leaving felt like surrendering to something I did not understand, and some stubborn part of me refused to give them that satisfaction. So I watched the plane take off and disappear into a gray sky, and I told myself I had made the right choice. By the middle of the month, the river was frozen solid, and the snow was waist-deep in places. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero, then 40. The village became a small cluster of lights in an endless darkness, cut off from everything. And somewhere out there in one of those houses, people were waiting for something. I did not know what, not yet, but I was about to find out. It was November 19th when Ruthie came to my cabin after dark. She had never visited me at home before, and when I opened the door and saw her standing there in the cold, her breath coming out in white clouds, I knew something had changed. She pushed past me without waiting to be invited, and stood in the middle of my small living room, rubbing her hands together. "There is going to be an accident soon," she said, her voice tight. "The Moreaus owe a debt. They have owed it for 3 generations. The Ivanovs and the Tulleks, they owe debts too. That is how it works here. That is how it has always worked." I asked her what she meant by debt, and she told me a story that made everything click into horrible place. Decades ago, before the village had any real connection to the outside world, the founding families made agreements with each other. Land rights, hunting territories, marriages, resources. When someone broke an agreement or wronged another family, there was a price. Not money, not property, blood. A life for a life passed down through generations until the debt was paid. It sounded insane, like something out of a history book about feudal societies. But Ruthie was not joking, and the fear in her eyes was absolutely real. She told me that the Moreau family had one more death owed to the Chukwu family, a wrong committed by someone's great-grandfather that had never been settled. This year, the debt was being called in. Elise, the little girl I had tried to help in September, was the one they had chosen. That was why her mother refused medical treatment. In their minds, there was no point in healing someone who was already marked. I felt sick. I asked Ruthie why she was telling me this, why now, and she said it was because I was the only person in the village who might actually do something. Everyone else had grown up with this system. They accepted it the way you accept gravity, not because it was right, but because it had always been there. Outsiders were usually discouraged from staying long enough to notice anything. But I had noticed, and I had kept asking questions, and now I was the only wild card in a game that had been playing out for generations. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my cabin with every light on, thinking through my options. Running was not possible. The snow was too deep, the cold too extreme. and the nearest town was over 60 miles away through wilderness. The satellite phone was still broken. I had no way to contact anyone outside. But I had something else: the clinic. Medical supplies, locked cabinets, and most importantly, a shortwave radio that I had seen in the back storage room during my first week. It was old and covered in dust, probably left over from the 80s, but it might still work. Before dawn, I walked to the clinic through knee-deep snow, my flashlight cutting a thin beam through the darkness. The radio was exactly where I remembered it. Took me almost an hour to figure out how to operate it, my fingers numb and clumsy. But finally I managed to reach a state trooper station in Fairbanks. I told them everything: the pattern of deaths, the threats, the little girl who was in danger. The officer on the other end sounded skeptical at first, but something in my voice must have convinced him, because he said he would send a team as soon as the weather cleared. He told me to stay inside, keep my head down, and wait. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I stayed in the clinic, sleeping on the exam table, eating canned food from the emergency supplies. On the second day, someone tried the door handle in the middle of the night. It was locked, and whoever it was eventually went away, but I did not close my eyes again until morning. On the fourth day, I heard the sound of helicopter blades cutting through the frozen air. 2 state troopers and a child welfare officer landed on the outskirts of the village, and within hours, Elise Moreau was in protective custody. I do not know exactly what happened after that. I was evacuated on the same helicopter and never went back. I heard later that several people were arrested, that the investigation uncovered evidence of at least 7 deaths that were being reclassified as homicides. The village of Koyukak was all over the news for a few weeks, and then the world moved on to other horrors. I still have the yellow legal pad with the threat written on the last page. Sometimes I take it out and look at that handwriting, and I wonder who wrote it. I wonder if they are still out there in some other small place keeping old debts alive. And I wonder how many other villages exist where the winter is long and accidents happen and nobody asks why. Working at a temporary construction camp in Alaska felt like a strange pause in my life, something I told myself was just a means to an end. I'd taken the job because the pay was good, and I needed to clear some debts, and the camp promised short rotations and long stretches of time off. At that point, my life was simple and quiet, mostly work, sleep, and the occasional call home when the satellite signal cooperated. The camp itself sat far from any real town, surrounded by uneven ground, frozen mud, and a horizon that never felt close. Rows of portable trailers were bolted into the dirt like they might slide away if no one watched them. Most of us were strangers to each other, passing through, carrying our own reasons for being there. That made it easy to keep your head down and mind your business. It also made it easy for things to happen without anyone asking too many questions. The day everything started to bother me wasn't dramatic at first, just oddly quiet. A guy named Trevor, who bunked 2 trailers down from me, didn't show up for breakfast. No note, no warning, just his locker cleared out and his boots gone. People said he'd quit overnight, which wasn't unheard of, but the way everyone accepted it felt rehearsed. This wasn't the first time either. Over the previous months, workers had vanished from the schedule between shifts. No goodbye drinks, no heated arguments with supervisors, nothing you'd expect from someone leaving suddenly. Management always brushed it off as personal issues or better offers elsewhere. The explanations were thin, but nobody pushed back. In a place like that, asking questions made you stand out. That night I worked the late shift, doing equipment checks near the edge of the camp where the lights barely reached. The generators hummed unevenly, and the cold crept through my gloves no matter how tightly I clenched my fingers. Somewhere past the trailers, I heard raised voices, low and sharp, like an argument being swallowed by the wind. I couldn't see who it was, only the outline of someone moving between structures, staying close to the shadows. When I walked closer, the voices stopped instantly, leaving behind an empty stretch of gravel and a feeling that I'd interrupted something I wasn't meant to see. Later, in the break room, a newer worker named Eli sat staring at the floor, jaw clenched, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. He clocked out early and didn't come back. By the next morning, Eli's trailer was locked and stripped bare, same as Trevor's. This time, though, I noticed scuff marks near the steps, deep grooves in the mud that looked like someone had been dragged or pushed hard. I brought it up quietly to a supervisor, who gave me a tight look and told me to focus on my job. That response stuck with me more than the marks themselves. Over lunch, a few of us traded glances but kept our mouths shut, the unspoken agreement hanging heavy in the air. Everyone sensed there was something ugly underneath these disappearances. The camp's isolation made it feel like its own world, one where rules bent easily and consequences stayed far away. By the end of that morning, I realized the problem wasn't just people leaving. It was what might have been happening to them before they did. After that, I started paying closer attention to the little things people usually ignored. Conversations would stop when certain footsteps passed by the trailers. A few workers flinched at raised voices, even when it was just joking around. One night during dinner, I noticed bruising along the neck of a guy named Marcus, half hidden by his jacket collar. When I asked if he was okay, he forced a laugh and said he'd slipped on ice. The explanation didn't match the marks, which were too narrow and uneven. He left camp 2 days later without collecting his last paycheck. Management posted his position as open before his bunk was even cleaned out. It felt like the camp itself swallowed people whole, erased them, and moved on. The tension peaked during a night shift when one of the welders, Aaron, failed to check in at the end of his rotation. His radio crackled with static when we tried to reach him, and the supervisor delayed organizing a search, insisting Aaron probably wandered off to cool down somewhere. That excuse made no sense in freezing conditions, especially with the terrain around us. When we finally went looking, we found his helmet near a storage container, dented and smeared with dark residue. No blood trail, no signs of a fall, just silence and the wind dragging loose plastic against metal. By morning, Aaron was officially listed as having quit mid-shift. Seeing that typed out on the board felt unreal, like watching someone rewrite reality. A few days later, investigators arrived after someone finally contacted authorities outside the camp. They spoke to us one by one in a makeshift office, asking careful questions about threats, fights, and people leaving suddenly. What surprised me was how similar everyone's stories were once they felt safe talking. Intimidation in dark hallways, warnings delivered in whispers, physical confrontations that were never reported. One name kept surfacing, always followed by nervous pauses. The camp's setup made it easy for one person to control space and information, especially with new workers rotating in constantly. Oversight was minimal, records sloppy, and complaints quietly buried. Listening to it all laid out made me realize this wasn't a series of bad coincidences. The investigation uncovered years of ignored reports and unofficial settlements, all designed to keep the project running without disruption. The person responsible had learned exactly how far they could go, without triggering intervention, exploiting isolation and fear like tools. Workers who resisted were pressured into leaving, while others stayed silent to protect their paychecks. Eventually, the suspect was removed from the site under guard, though details were never fully shared with us. The camp didn't shut down, it just adjusted, pretending the problem had been solved cleanly. Even after things returned to a surface-level normal, the atmosphere never recovered. Every sound after dark carried weight, and trust between co-workers felt permanently damaged. I stayed long enough to see the investigators leave and the company issue a short statement about improved safety protocols. Nothing about the people who vanished, nothing about Aaron, nothing about the fear that had settled into the camp like a second climate. A few trailers were moved, a new supervisor rotated in, and we were told to report anything unusual. The words sounded empty by then. At night, the camp still felt watched, even with extra lighting and new faces around. People avoided being alone after dark, pairing up for cigarette breaks or bathroom runs. Sleep came in short, shallow bursts, broken by every sound of metal shifting or boots crunching outside. The place had learned our routines, and we couldn't unlearn what it had shown us. The day I decided to leave came quietly, without drama. I packed my duffel in the early morning, hands moving on instinct while my mind replayed small moments I hadn't questioned before. The way certain doors were always locked, the lack of cameras near storage areas, the silence from management when complaints surfaced. None of it felt accidental anymore. I turned in my badge without explaining myself, and no one asked why. That part disturbed me the most. It was as if the camp expected departures, accepted them as part of its design. When the transport truck pulled away, I watched the trailers shrink into the distance, lined up neatly like they hadn't held anything terrible inside them. Months later, back in normal life, the memories still surface at odd times. A generator hum can pull me right back to those nights, or the smell of diesel mixed with cold air. I read about similar camps online and see the same patterns repeated in different places. Temporary jobs, isolated locations, workers who pass through without roots. It creates gaps where accountability should be, and those gaps invite the wrong kind of people. I don't know what ultimately happened to everyone who disappeared. Some may have escaped before things got worse, others might not have been so lucky. That uncertainty is harder to live with than a clear answer. I'm sharing this here because places like that don't advertise their dangers. They sell opportunity, fast money, and the idea that you can endure anything for a short time. What I learned is that isolation changes the rules, and silence can be trained into people without them noticing. If you ever find yourself somewhere remote where people vanish quietly and no one wants to talk about it, pay attention. Leaving without explanation might look strange from the outside, but sometimes it's the only option left. I walked away with my life and a story that still doesn't sit right. Others didn't even get that much. At that point in my life, I was drifting between seasonal jobs, chasing contracts the way some people chase weather. Alaska felt like the right kind of distance. I was in my late 20s, traveling alone, working temporary gigs wherever someone needed an extra pair of hands before winter shut everything down. I didn't have much tying me anywhere, just a packed car, a notebook with phone numbers, and a habit of trusting my own planning a little too much. That morning started like dozens of others on the road. Cheap coffee, stiff muscles, and a long stretch of highway waiting ahead. I remember thinking that if I could reach the next town before dark, everything would stay on schedule. The light was already thinner than I liked, stretched low and pale across the road. Still, nothing about the day felt dramatic or unusual. It felt routine, and that's what makes it hard to explain now. The roadside stop sat alone against miles of nothing. A squat building with buzzing fluorescent lights, and a parking lot chewed up by gravel. Inside, the air smelled like burnt coffee and old fryer oil, the kind that sticks to your clothes. The woman behind the counter had tired eyes and kept glancing at the clock on the wall, tapping her pen like she was counting down to freedom. I told her I was heading toward the next town and expected to be there before nightfall. She gave me a look that lingered a second too long, then said something vague about the road being quiet lately. There was a corkboard near the door with handwritten notes for rides, missing dogs, odd local ads. One of the papers had been torn halfway down, as if someone changed their mind mid-sentence. I paid, thanked her, and walked back outside with that image still stuck in my head. The drive after that felt different, though nothing obvious had changed. The highway narrowed and twisted, the trees pressing closer, swallowing sound. Radio stations dissolved into static, then vanished altogether, leaving only the low hum of the engine. I noticed a vehicle behind me for a while, dark-colored, hard to pin down, but it never got close enough for me to read anything useful. When it finally disappeared, the absence felt louder than its presence had. I kept checking the dashboard clock, doing mental math about distance and fading daylight. The sky was slipping toward that heavy blue-gray that comes fast in remote places. I told myself I was imagining tension where there was none. Being alone that long messes with your head. Or at least that's what I believed then. The last clear memory I have of that stretch comes from pulling over near a wide shoulder, thinking I should double-check my map before continuing. The engine cut, and the silence rushed in immediately, thick and pressing. My keys weren't in the cup holder where I always dropped them, which struck me as odd enough to make my chest tighten. I searched the seats, the floor, the console, telling myself not to jump to conclusions. That's when I noticed how untouched everything else was. My bag still zipped, jacket folded the way I'd left it. No sign that anyone had been inside the car. The road was empty in both directions, stretching endlessly, offering no clues and no comfort. Standing there, surrounded by wilderness that didn't care whether I existed or not, I understood how easy it would be for someone to vanish without a sound. What I didn't realize at the time was how quickly small decisions start stacking up when you're isolated. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the wind scrape through the brush and feeling watched without seeing anyone. After a while, I noticed impressions in the gravel that didn't match my tires, faint but fresh, angled as if another vehicle had stopped nearby and then rolled on. It bothered me enough to make me scan the tree line, counting breaths, telling myself to stay calm and practical. I locked the car out of habit even though I couldn't find the keys, and that contradiction made my head spin. The light kept thinning, draining color from everything, and the idea of waiting there suddenly felt reckless. I decided to walk a short distance down the highway, thinking maybe the keys had fallen when I stepped out. That choice still echoes in my mind. The road felt longer on foot, every sound magnified by the emptiness. Gravel shifted under my boots, loud enough to make me wince. After a few minutes, I heard an engine somewhere behind me, slow and steady, not rushing. I moved closer to the shoulder, rehearsing what I'd say if someone stopped, friendly but guarded, grateful but not desperate. The vehicle passed without slowing, close enough that I caught a glimpse of the driver's profile. Eyes forward, jaw tight, both hands high on the wheel. No wave, no acknowledgement. The wind carried the smell of exhaust for a moment, then swallowed it. That was when the reality of my situation settled in fully. Night was coming fast, and I was suddenly very alone. I turned back toward my car, faster now, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't neatly explain. The sky had deepened into a dull, bruised color, and the forest on either side looked denser than before, like it had crept closer while I wasn't looking. When I reached the spot where I'd left the car, my stomach clenched, not from panic, but from disbelief. The car was still there exactly as I'd left it, but the driver's door stood open a few inches. Inside, nothing was disturbed. No broken glass, no mess, no obvious signs of interference. Just the quiet and the open door, waiting. I shut it slowly, every sense tuned tight, trying to decide whether staying or leaving on foot made more sense. I spent that night inside the car, curled up low, conserving heat and listening to every shift in the air. At some point, footsteps passed nearby, careful and measured, stopping just far enough away that I couldn't pinpoint them. No voice, no flashlight beam, no sudden movement, just the unmistakable sound of someone standing there, deciding something. Eventually, the steps retreated, dissolving back into the dark. When morning finally came, gray and weak, the keys were sitting on the hood, neatly placed as if to be found. I didn't question it. I got in, started the engine, and drove until I reached a town with people and noise and walls. I reported what happened, and searches were done, but nothing else turned up. Even now, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. I only know that the isolation didn't protect me. It exposed me. After I reached that town, everything moved fast in a way that felt unreal. People asked questions while handing me coffee, while filling out forms, while glancing at each other when I described the open door and the keys on the hood. They focused on timelines, directions, mile markers. I kept trying to explain the feeling of being evaluated out there, like someone had been testing how far they could push before I broke. Search teams went back along the highway before the light faded again, combing ditches and tree lines, marking spots with little flags. I watched from the edge of the road, wrapped in a borrowed jacket, feeling strangely detached from my own story. Everyone kept saying how lucky I was. I nodded because that's what you do when you don't have the words to disagree. As the day stretched on, the questions shifted. Had I noticed anyone at the roadside stop? Did anyone seem too interested in my plans? I mentioned the board with the torn paper, the look the woman gave me when I talked about reaching town before night. One of the officers exchanged a glance with another and wrote something down without comment. They asked if I'd heard rumors about people disappearing along that route. I hadn't, but the way they phrased it told me enough. The wilderness wasn't just empty, it was useful. Miles of road, few witnesses, long delays before anyone noticed something was wrong. Anyone patient enough could wait out there and never leave a trace. By evening, they told me there was nothing more to do until morning. I sat alone in a small room at a motel, staring at my phone, replaying every choice I'd made since sunrise. I realized how close I'd come to doing exactly what I said at the counter, pushing forward until dark, trusting the road to take care of me. If I hadn't stopped when I did, if I'd ignored that missing key moment, the story might have ended very differently. The thought didn't come with dramatic fear, just a dull, heavy certainty. Some mistakes don't announce themselves. They wait quietly for you to be tired enough to make them. I left Alaska not long after that. I finished the contract I was there for, but the rest of the trip felt hollow, like I was moving through someone else's life. I still think about that stretch of highway and how calm everything looked on the surface. People ask if I believe someone was responsible, or if it was just coincidence and bad luck brushing up against isolation. I don't argue either way. All I know is that the road gave someone an opportunity, and that opportunity almost included me. When I tell this now, it's not for answers. It's so someone else might hesitate at a lonely stop and decide not to trust the distance the way I did.